Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
One summer, I took a job as a temporary groundskeeper for a large botanical garden. It was a dream job, lush greenery, exotic flowers, and the calm solitude of nature. Most of the groundskeeping crew worked during the day, but my shift started at 3 p.m. and went until 11 p.m. The idea was to clean up after visitors and prepare the garden for the next day. The botanical garden sprawled over acres, and some sections were rarely visited, even during peak hours. One such area was the stone pathway, an older, lesser maintained part of the garden featuring a windy trail through overgrown shrubs and crumbling stone steps. One evening, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, I was assigned to clean up the stone pathway. It wasn't my favorite place, it always seemed colder there, and the thick canopy above made it darker than the rest of the garden. But the job was simple: clear fallen branches, pick up trash, and report any damage. I was halfway through the trail when I saw it. A single garden glove was lying in the middle of the path. It wasn't unusual for visitors to drop things, so I picked it up, intending to place it in the lost and found later. But as I continued down the path, I found another glove, a different one, then a scarf, then a child's sandal. They were spaced just far enough apart to seem deliberately placed, leading me further down the path. At this point, the sun was gone and the path was cloaked in shadow. The garden's automated lights hadn't turned on yet, so I used my flashlight to navigate. As I followed the scattered trail of belongings, my unease grew. Each item looked slightly older, dirtier, and more weathered than the last. Finally, I reached a small clearing where the path ended. In the middle of the clearing was a wooden bench, and sitting on it was a figure. They were hunched over, their back to me, and their head down. I could tell from their silhouette that they were clutching something in their lap. My first thought was that he was a homeless person who had somehow wandered into the garden after hours, but as I shone my flashlight on them, they didn't react. "Excuse me," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "The garden is closed. You need to leave." No response. I stepped closer, my flashlight trained on them. "Sir," they have them. Still nothing. I was about 10 feet away when I noticed the smell. It was faint but distinct, like damp earth and decaying leaves. My instincts screamed at me to turn around, but my feet were rooted to the ground. Finally, the figure moved, not to turn toward me or stand up, but to lift their hands, revealing the object in their lap. It was a small, rusted trowel, and then they spoke, but their voice was hollow, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. "Did you bring it back?" I had no idea what they were talking about. "Hi, I don't know what you mean." They turned their head slightly, just enough for me to see the side of their face. Pale, too pale. The texture of their skin reminded me of dried out clay. Their eyes, if you could call them that, were sunken hollows. "Did you bring it back?" they repeated, more insistent this time. I dropped everything, the gloves, the flashlight, even my radio, and ran. I don't think I stopped until I was back at the visitor center, gasping for breath. When I told my supervisor what had happened, he looked at me with a strange mix of concern and resignation. "You went to the stone pathway?" he asked quietly. I nodded. He sighed. "We don't send staff there at night." "Didn't anyone tell you?" "No one had." I quit the next day. A few months passed after I left the job, but I couldn't shake the memory of that night. The stone pathway stayed in my dreams, twisting and turning like a maze, always ending at that same clearing with the figure on the bench. Sometimes, in the dream, they would turn fully toward me, and I'd wake up drenched in sweat before I could see their face. One night, unable to sleep, I decided to look up the botanical garden's history. If my former supervisor knew something he wasn't saying, maybe the answer was out there. It didn't take long to find some interesting tidbits buried in local forums and old newspaper archives. Apparently, the stone pathway was one of the oldest parts of the garden, built decades before the rest of the grounds. Originally, it had been part of a private estate belonging to a family named the Driscolls. The house had burned down in the early 1900s, and the land was sold to the city. The Driscoll family had been known for their eccentricities, particularly the youngest daughter, Eleanor. She had a habit of wandering the grounds alone, often leaving small belongings behind as markers to find her way back. But the story took a darker turn. One night, Eleanor didn't return to the house. They found her body near what would later become the clearing on the stone pathway. The official cause of death was listed as exposure, but there were rumors, talk of something more sinister. Some believed she had been lured into the woods by someone or something she thought she could trust. The unsettling part, the belongings scattered along the path that night matched those described in old police reports: gloves, scarves, and a single child's sandal. They were items Eleanor had been carrying when she disappeared. I told myself it was just coincidence. Maybe the items I found were a prank left by some overzealous visitor who knew the story. But deep down, I couldn't convince myself it was that simple. There had been something too deliberate, too eerie about the way they were laid out. A few weeks later, I received a package in the mail. It didn't have a return address, just my name scrawled scrawled in shaky handwriting. I opened it, and my stomach dropped. Inside was the flashlight I had abandoned that night on the stone pathway, but it wasn't the same as I remembered. It was rusted, as if it had been left outside for years, and the beam didn't work anymore. There was also a single piece of paper folded neatly in half. On it, written in the same shaky handwriting as the address, were 3 words: "Did you bring it?" I moved cities the following week, refusing to give anyone at the garden my forwarding address. To this day, I don't know how they found me or who they even are. If you ever visit a botanical garden and see a path that feels just a little too quiet, a little too forgotten, please, for the love of everything, don't follow it. And if you find any gloves, scarves, or sandals along the way, don't pick them up. For months after I moved, I avoided any mention of the botanical garden. I deleted old contacts from my time there, ignored emails, and even stopped gardening in my new backyard. But it didn't matter how far I ran or how much I tried to push it away, the stone pathway had wormed its way into my mind. The dreams grew worse. They weren't just about the figure on the bench anymore. Now, I'd see myself walking the path, hearing faint footsteps behind me. When I'd turn around, no one was there. Sometimes, in the dream, I'd try to leave, only to find that the path never ended. It just stretched on forever, growing darker and colder with each step. One night, I woke up to find muddy footprints leading from my bedroom window to the foot of my bed. My heart froze. The window had been locked, and there was no sign of forced entry, yet the footprints were unmistakable, small and barefoot, like those of a child. They led right up to my bed, then stopped. I spent that night at a motel. The next day, I went online and reached out to a paranormal investigator. Desperate times call for desperate measures. A woman named Clara responded to my post. She claimed to have experience with residual hauntings and what she called place-bound entities. I didn't care if it sounded ridiculous, I needed answers. Clara visited my house a few days later. She was younger than I expected, in her early 30s, with an air of quiet confidence. She carried a bag filled with tools I didn't recognize, candles, strange-looking crystals, and a notebook with symbols scribbled all over it. After I explained everything, she sat silently for a long moment, then nodded. "You didn't just encounter something," she said. "You took part in it, whether you meant to or not." I didn't understand what she meant, but she insisted on performing a cleansing ritual in my home. She burned sage, whispered chants in a language I didn't know, and placed salt in every corner of the house. It helped. For a while, the dream stopped, and I started to feel like I could finally breathe again. But then, one evening, Clara called me, her voice urgent. "I've been doing research on the Driscoll family," she said. "Elena wasn't the only one who disappeared. There were 3 others over the years: gardeners, a visitor, and even a security guard. All of them were last seen near the stone pathway." My stomach turned as she continued. "There's a theory that Elena wasn't lured there. She was doing the luring." I tried to protest, to tell her she must be mistaken, but deep down, I knew she wasn't. The figure on the bench, the belongings on the path, the whisper asking, "Did you bring it?" It all made a twisted kind of sense. And then she dropped the bombshell. "You left something behind, didn't you?" My heart sank. "The flashlight. That's her way of tethering you," Clara said. "She uses what you leave to keep you connected. You have to go back. You have to take it and destroy it." I wanted to hang up, to ignore her and pretend it was over, but I couldn't. I knew Clara was right. The dreams, the footprints, the package, it wasn't going to stop until I faced it. So, against every instinct in my body, I made plans to return to the garden. The night I went back, the air was heavy with the promise of rain. The garden had closed hours earlier, but Clara had arranged for us to sneak in. She came with me, though I could tell she was nervous. We made our way to the stone pathway, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. When we reached the clearing, it was exactly as I remembered it. The bench, the oppressive silence, the feeling that we weren't alone. The figure wasn't there, but my rusted flashlight lay on the ground where I had dropped it months ago. It looked even more decayed than before, almost unrecognizable. Clara lit a candle and handed it to me. "Pick it up," she said softly, "and don't let go, no matter what." I hesitated, but finally bent down and grabbed the flashlight. The second my hand touched it, the temperature plummeted, and the wind picked up, howling through the trees. Shadows danced around us, and I swear I heard faint whispers, like dozens of voices speaking at once. Clara began chanting, louder and faster. The whispers grew into cries, angry and desperate, but I held onto the flashlight, clutching it like a lifeline. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It was the same as before, hunched over, clutching that rusted trowel. But this time, it stood up. It started moving toward us. "Now!" Clara screamed. "Destroy it." I threw the flashlight onto the ground, and Clara poured salt and some kind of oil over it before setting it ablaze. The fire flared unnaturally bright, and the figure let out an ear-piercing shriek before vanishing into the darkness. The clearing fell silent. We didn't stick around. Clara and I ran back to the visitor center, neither of us daring to look back. Since that night, the dreams have stopped. My house feels like my own again, and I haven't seen any more footprints. Clara told me she thinks it's over, that a leader's tether to me has been severed. I want to believe her. This happened about 5 years ago when I was visiting a small town in New England. It was one of those picturesque places with cobblestone streets and old brick buildings. I had the day to myself and decided to do some window shopping. That's how I stumbled upon a tiny antique shop tucked between a bakery and a flower shop. The shop had no sign, just a small bell over the door and a display of old clocks and watches in the window. Inside, the place smelled of dust and aged wood. Every surface was cluttered with knickknacks, faded photographs, and oddities I couldn't quite place. The only other person there was the shopkeeper, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a voice that was almost too cheerful. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but a large grandfather clock in the back corner caught my eye. It was beautifully carved, with intricate details of stars and swirling clouds etched into the wood. It wasn't ticking, which seemed odd for a clock in such good condition. When I asked the shopkeeper about it, her smile wavered slightly. "Oh, that one," she said, her tone a little too light. "It's a display piece. Doesn't work." Something about the way she said it made me uneasy, but I shrugged it off. I spent another 15 minutes browsing before I decided to leave. Just as I was heading out the door, she called after me, "Don't touch the clock." I stopped and turned. She wasn't smiling anymore. Her eyes were wide, and her face was pale. "I mean it," she said, her voice low now. "Don't go near it." I laughed awkwardly and nodded, trying to shake off the weirdness. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the clock. I told myself it was just my curiosity, but deep down, I knew it was something more. The way the shopkeeper had looked at me, it was almost like she was scared for me. The next morning, I went back to the shop. The bell over the door jingled, but the shop was empty. It felt colder than it had the day before, and the air was heavier, like a storm was brewing. I walked straight to the grandfather clock. Up close, I could see more of the details, tiny faces etched into the wood, their mouths open in silent screams. My stomach churned. Why hadn't I noticed that before? I reached out to touch the clock, half expecting the shopkeeper to come rushing in, but no one stopped me. The moment my fingers brushed the wood, the room grew impossibly still. All the faint sounds of the street outside vanished. My hand jerked back as a chill ran up my spine. That's when I noticed the clock's pendulum. It was moving now, slowly at first, then faster. The hands of the clock, which had been frozen at 12:03, started spinning wildly. Then I heard it, a soft whisper so faint I almost thought I was imagining it. But the whisper grew louder, a cacophony of overlapping voices, all saying the same thing. "Leave." I stumbled back, knocking into a shelf. A glass figurine crashed to the floor, shattering. The noise broke whatever trance I was in, and I bolted out of the shop without looking back. I never went back to that antique shop. In fact, I left the town entirely that same day. A week later, I tried to find it online, hoping to make sense of what had happened. But there was no record of it, no listing, no photos, nothing. To this day, I can't explain what I saw or why the shopkeeper was so insistent that I stay away from the clock. All I know is that I'll never forget the way those tiny faces looked, frozen in silent terror. I thought that would be the end of it, just a strange memory I'd carry with me for the rest of my life. But a few weeks later, I started noticing something. It began with small things. My bedroom clock stopped ticking one night, even though I had just replaced the batteries. Then my watch stopped too. I figured it was just bad luck, but the unease lingered. One morning, I woke up to find all the clocks in my house, wall clocks, digital clocks, even the clock on my oven, stuck at the same time. 12:03. My stomach dropped. I hadn't thought about the grandfather clock in days, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. I threw away every clock in my house that same day, convinced that getting rid of them would solve the problem. It didn't. That night, I woke up to the sound of ticking. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. I searched my entire house, tearing through drawers and cabinets, but there was nothing, just that relentless ticking. When I tried to ignore it and go back to bed, I had a vivid dream, or maybe it wasn't a dream at all. I was standing in the antique shop, staring at the grandfather clock. The hands were spinning again, faster and faster, and I could hear those whispers. This time, they weren't telling me to leave. They were saying my name. The next morning, I called my best friend, Emily, and told her everything. She tried to reassure me, saying it was probably stress or an overactive imagination, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. I asked her to stay over that night, just in case. Around midnight, the ticking started again. Emily heard it too, and for a moment, I felt a twisted kind of relief. At least I wasn't losing my mind. We followed the sound to my living room, but there was nothing there, just the empty space where my wall clock used to hang. Then Emily froze. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing to the corner of the room. At first, I didn't, but then I noticed a shadow, darker than the rest of the room, standing perfectly still. It wasn't cast by anything, it was just there, and in the center of the shadow, I saw the faint outline of a clock face. "Get out," I whispered to Emily, my voice shaking. We ran out of the house and didn't stop until we were halfway down the street. The ticking had followed us, growing louder and louder until we couldn't hear anything else. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. That was the last night I stayed in that house. I packed packed up and moved in with Emily the next day. I didn't tell her, but when I was unpacking my suitcase, I found something that wasn't mine, a small, carved wooden figure of a clock with tiny, screaming faces etched into it. I buried it in the backyard and never looked back. Even now, I sometimes hear fate ticking when I'm alone. It's never loud, never insistent, just a reminder that whatever followed me from that antique shop is still there, watching and waiting. I tried to settle into my life at Emily's place, convincing myself that burying the wooden figure had severed whatever connection I had to that cursed clock. For a while, things seemed normal. The ticking stopped, the nightmares faded, and I started to believe I was free of it. Until last week. It started with Emily's cat, Milo. He'd always been a sweet, lazy creature, but one night, he started acting strangely. He wouldn't go near my room, hissing and arching his back whenever I tried to coax him in. Then, I began waking up to find him sitting outside my door, staring at it with unblinking eyes. Emily brushed it off, saying cats were weird like that, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling it gave me. The night after Milo's behavior started, I woke up to a sound I hadn't heard in months. To him, it was faint at first, like it was coming from far away. But as I lay there, frozen in my bed, it grew louder and louder until it felt like it was right next to my ear. I tried to turn on the lamp beside my bed, but the bulb flickered and died. That's when I saw it. At the foot of my bed, a shadow began to form. It wasn't cast by anything, it was just there, growing darker and more defined. Within the shadow, I could see the outline of a clock face, its hands spinning so fast they blurred. The whisper started again, the same overlapping voices from the antique shop, but this time they weren't saying my name. They were laughing. I scrambled out of bed, fumbling for my phone. The screen lit up, but the time was frozen at 12:03. Panic surged through me as the ticking grew deafening, drowning out even my own ragged breathing. I don't remember running out of the room, but I found myself in Emily's hallway, pounding on her door. She opened it, her face pale and confused, and I threw myself into her arms, sobbing. "What's wrong?" she asked, but I couldn't find the words to explain. All I could say was, "It's here." The next day, I decided to do something I'd been avoiding since this whole thing started. I called a priest. I wasn't particularly religious, but I figured if anyone could help, it would be someone with experience in, well, unexplainable phenomena. The priest, Father Michaels, listened patiently as I told him everything. He didn't laugh or dismiss me, which was both comforting and unsettling. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "This isn't the first time I've heard of something like this," he said. "Objects like that clock can act as anchors for things, spirits, entities, whatever you want to call them. They latch onto people, feeding off their fear. If you've already buried the wooden figure, that's a good start, but it might not be enough." He suggested a cleansing ritual, both for me and for Emily's apartment. I agreed, desperate for anything that might help. The ritual itself was uneventful, but that night, I had another dream or vision. I was back in the antique shop, standing in front of the grandfather clock. This time, the shopkeeper was there, her face gaunt and tired. "I told you not to touch it," she said, her voice echoing in the stillness. "It's too late now." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "How do I stop it?" She shook her head. "You don't stop it. You survive it." When I woke up, I found a new object on my nightstand, a small wooden clock, identical to the one I had buried. Its hands were frozen at 12:03. Now, I'm writing this from a motel room in another state. I've changed my number, quit my job, and cut ties with almost everyone I know. Emily doesn't understand why I left so abruptly, and I can't bring myself to tell her. I don't want her getting dragged into this any more than she already has. The ticking follows me everywhere now. It's always faint, just on the edge of hearing, but it's there. The whispers come and go, too, their laughter more taunting than ever. I've stopped sleeping, afraid of what I'll see if I close my eyes. To anyone reading this, if you ever come across an antique shop with no sign and a beautiful, intricate grandfather clock in the back corner, don't go inside. Don't touch the clock. Don't even look at it for too long. This happened a few years ago when I was traveling through a small, picturesque town in Europe. It wasn't my original destination, but a train delay left me with an unexpected layover. The town was charming, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. Cobbled streets, colorful buildings, and an unusual number of chapels, some grand, some barely more than a single room. I spent the afternoon wandering around, snapping photos, and browsing the local shops. By evening, the streets began to empty out. A soft mist rolled in, making everything look even more like a postcard, though it muffled the sounds around me in an unsettling way. As I strolled back toward the small inn where I was staying, I noticed a ribbon tied to a lamppost. It was bright red, standing out vividly against the gray evening. It was tied neatly in a bow, fluttering slightly in the breeze. Something about it seemed deliberate, but also out of place. I looked around but didn't see anyone nearby. I passed another lamppost a few steps later, and it too had a red ribbon. Save me, bow. My heart gave a nervous flutter. It wasn't like these were decorations left from a festival. The ribbons were too fresh, too clean. I decided decided to pick up my pace. The street curved slightly, and as I turned the corner, I spotted a small chapel at the end of the road. It hadn't been there when I walked through earlier, or at least, I didn't remember seeing it. There was nothing remarkable about it, plain stone walls, a wooden door, and a small bell tower, except, of course, for the red ribbon tied to the iron gate at its entrance. The mist was thicker now, and the street lights seemed dimmer. A strange, muffled ringing came from the chapel, like bells being struck with something soft. I felt an overwhelming urge to go back to the inn, but curiosity, stupid curiosity, pulled me forward. The gate was slightly ajar, the ribbon fluttering invitingly. I pushed it open just enough to slip through and stepped into the small courtyard. The muffled ringing continued, rhythmic and deliberate. My heart was pounding, and every instinct was screaming at me to turn around, but I kept walking toward the chapel door. It was slightly open, just a crack, enough for me to see the dim glow of candlelight inside. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet night. No answer, just the continued ringing. I nudged the door open wider and stepped inside. The interior was small, with rows of wooden pews and a simple altar at the front. Candles lined the walls, their flames flickering in a way that didn't seem entirely natural. The air was thick with the scent of wax and something else I couldn't place, something metallic, like blood. And then I saw it. At the front of the chapel, where the altar should have been, there was a figure. It was cloaked in black, its face obscured by a hood. In its hands, it held a small bell, which it rang slowly and deliberately. But the sound wasn't coming from the bell, it was coming from somewhere deeper, somewhere I couldn't see. The figure stopped ringing the bell and turned toward me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and cold. My legs finally caught up with my brain, and I turned and bolted out of the chapel, not caring how much noise I made. As I ran back to the gate, I noticed that all the red ribbons were gone. The lampposts were bare. The mist was gone too, leaving the street eerily clear. I didn't stop running until I reached the inn, where I locked my door and spent the night staring at the window, waiting for something or someone to appear. The next morning, I tried to find the chapel again, thinking maybe I could convince myself it was a dream or some overactive imagination fueled by exhaustion. But the street where I'd seen it was just an empty alley, no chapel, no ribbons, nothing. As I boarded the train that afternoon, I couldn't shake the eerie feeling that something or someone was watching me. I found a seat by the window, facing the direction the train would travel, and settled in, trying to put distance between myself and the strange events of the night before. The train began to move, and the picturesque countryside blurred into rolling hills and dense forests. I tried to focus on the scenery, but my mind kept drifting back to the red ribbons, the chapel, and that hooded figure. About an hour into the journey, I noticed something odd. Among the green of the trees and fields, there was a flash of red. It was faint at first, but as the train passed through a wooded area, I began to see more of them. Red ribbons tied to tree branches, flapping in the breeze. My stomach twisted. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was some local custom or decoration for an event. Maybe it had nothing to do with what I saw last night. But as the ribbons became more frequent, I knew that wasn't the case. They were tied in the same neat bow, the same vivid red. I turned to the passenger sitting across the aisle, an older man reading a newspaper. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you see those red ribbons out there?" He glanced out the window, his face blank. "Ribbons? No, I don't see anything." I forced a nervous laugh. "Never mind. Must be my eyes playing tricks on me." He nodded, uninterested, and went back to his paper. I stared out the window again, heart pounding. The ribbons were still there, now tied to fences and road signs along the tracks. The train slowed as we approached a small station. I hadn't paid attention to the schedule, but this didn't look like a planned stop. There was no sign of a platform, just an overgrown clearing with a weathered bench and an old signpost leaning precariously. And there it was again, a red ribbon tied to the signpost. The train stopped completely, the engine hissing as the doors slid open. No one got off, and no one got on. The conductor's voice came over the intercom, announcing a brief delay due to a signaling issue. I felt a chill run down my spine. I had to get out of there. Something about the ribbons felt deliberate, like they were guiding me or trapping me. I looked around, hoping to find some reassurance in the faces of the other passengers, but no one seemed concerned. Most were reading or scrolling through their phones. Then I saw her. A woman stood on the platform, or what passed for one. She was tall and thin, her long dark hair blowing in the wind. She wore a white dress, but what caught my attention was the red ribbon around her neck. She was staring directly at me. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but her expression was pleading, desperate. I pressed my hand to the glass, a reflex I couldn't explain, and as I did, she raised her hand in return, pointing toward the train car door. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. She kept pointing, her eyes wide with urgency. The train jolted slightly, and the doors began to close. Relief washed over me as the woman stepped back, disappearing into the trees. The train started moving again, leaving the ribbons and the strange stop behind. The rest of the ride was uneventful, but the woman's face stayed with me. Her pleading expression, the way her mouth moved, was she trying to warn me? Or was she trying to lure me out? When I finally reached my destination, destination, I told myself I'd leave all of it behind. I'd forget the ribbons, the chapel, the hooded figure, and the woman on the platform. But as I settled into my hotel that night, I pulled out my camera, curious to see the photos I'd taken in the picturesque town. As I scrolled through the images, my breath caught. There, in the background of several photos, was the same woman, always distant, always watching. It's been years since that trip, but the unease has never fully left me. Life moved on, but every so often, something reminds me of that strange town. A flash of red out of the corner of my eye, the sound of fate bells carried on the wind, a fleeting, unshakable sense that someone is watching. For a long time, I convinced myself it was all in my head. The ribbons, the chapel, the woman, they were just figments of an exhausted mind or some local folklore I didn't understand. But then, a few months ago, I received a package in the mail. It was unmarked, with no return address, and arrived at my apartment in the city. I assumed it was a mistake, something meant for a neighbor, but when I opened it, my blood ran cold. Inside was a single red ribbon, neatly tied in a bow. I stared at it, my hands shaking, trying to make sense of it. Who could have sent this? How did they know where I lived? There was no note, no explanation, just the ribbon. I threw it in the trash and tried to forget about it, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The next day, I found the ribbon again. It was on my kitchen counter, the bow just as perfect as before. I had no explanation for how it got there, and that's what terrified me the most. My apartment was locked, with no sign of forced entry. I grabbed it, stuffed it into a drawer, and left for work, desperate to get out of the house. When I came home that evening, the ribbon was gone. In its place was something new, a small, silver bell, sitting in the middle of my dining table. It was polished to a shine, the kind of bell you might see on an old hotel counter. There was no ribbon, no note, just the bell. I didn't touch it. I didn't even step into the room. I backed out, locked the door, and spent the night at a friend's house, too afraid to be alone. The next morning, I called the police. They checked the apartment and found nothing out of the ordinary. No signs of a break-in, no fingerprints. The bell was gone too, as if it had never been there. Since then, the occurrences have been sporadic but undeniable. A red ribbon tied to my doorknob one week, faint ringing sounds outside my window another. I've moved twice, changed my phone number, even left social media, but it doesn't seem to matter. The ribbons always find me. The most recent incident was the worst. I was walking home late after a night out with friends. The streets were quiet, the kind of stillness that presses on your chest. As I turned a corner, I saw them, red ribbons tied to every lamppost lining the street. My heart sank. I stopped in my tracks, looking around for anyone, anything that could explain this. That's when I heard it, the soft, rhythmic ringing of a bell. It was faint at first, but it grew louder with every passing second. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, and that only made it worse. It felt like it was all around me, echoing off the walls of the buildings. I started running, my footsteps pounding against the pavement, but no matter how far I went, the sound followed. When I finally reached my apartment, I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. The ringing had stopped, but my heart was still racing. I stayed awake all night, too scared to sleep. The next morning, I found something new. On my coffee table was a photograph. It was of the chapel, the same one I'd seen all those years ago. The image was faded, almost antique looking, but the red ribbon tied to the iron gate was unmistakable. And standing in front of the gate was the hooded figure. I don't know how this ends. I don't know what they want from me, or why they won't leave me alone. All I know is that it's only a matter of time before they make their next move. This happened when I was in college, working as a part-time assistant at a historic opera house in my city. It was one of those old, ornate buildings with velvet curtains, golden accents, and a heavy air of grandeur. Most of my job consisted of mundane tasks, helping with tours, ushering during events, and occasionally running errands for the managers. But one day, I was asked to clean and organize the Fete room. The Fete room was an oddity, even by the opera house's standards. It was a small, tucked-away space near the upper balcony, said to be where Victorian women would go to recover when their corsets became too tight. I passed it before but never paid much attention. It was always locked, and I assumed it was just a storage room now. But my manager handed me a key and said they were thinking of reopening it for private tours, so it needed a deep clean. I wasn't thrilled about the task. Dust and spiderwebs weren't my thing, but I figured it was an easy way to kill a few hours. I grabbed a cleaning kit and made my way up to the Fete room. The key slid into the lock with a surprising smoothness, considering how old it was. When I opened the door, the first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't musty as I'd expected, but faintly floral, like dried roses. The room was small and oval-shaped, with a chaise lounge in the center, an antique vanity against one wall, and heavy curtains over a single window. I started dusting the vanity, and that's when I noticed the mirror. It wasn't cracked or discolored like most old mirrors. It was pristine, almost too clean. The reflection was sharp, but it gave me a strange feeling, like it was showing the room slightly wrong. I can't explain it, but it felt like the reflection was just a second out of sync with reality. I shook off the unease and moved moved to the chaise lounge. It was covered in a sheet, and when I pulled it off, a small cloud of dust rose into the air. That's when I saw something that made my stomach drop. Carved into the wood frame of the lounge, right near where someone's head would rest, were the words, "Don't sit here." It looked old, like it had been scratched into the wood decades ago. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of joke from a past employee, but it felt rugged. I snapped a picture of it with my phone, figuring I'd show my manager later, and moved on to the curtains. When I pulled them back, the floral smell grew stronger. I looked out the window and realized something was off. From this angle, I should have been able to see the street below, but all I saw was an expanse of black. Not nighttime darkness, just nothing. I stared at it for a long moment, feeling my pulse quicken before deciding I'd had enough. I gathered my supplies and turned to leave, but as I reached for the door, I heard a soft creak behind me. I froze, my hand on the doorknob, and slowly, I turned back toward the chaise lounge. Someone was sitting there. It was a woman dressed in a Victorian gown, her face obscured by a veil. She was leaning forward, her gloved hands clasped tightly together as if she was sobbing silently, but there was no sound, just the faint smell of roses growing stronger and stronger. I blinked, and she was gone. I didn't waste any time. I threw open the door and ran down the stairs, leaving the cleaning supplies behind. When I told my manager what happened, they gave me a strange look and said, "You're not the first person to say something like that about that room." Needless to say, I quit the job a few weeks later. I don't know what I saw or what was in that room, but I hope I never have to find out. For weeks after I left the job at the Opera House, I couldn't shake the experience. The fainty room haunted my thoughts in a way that nothing else ever had. I'd catch myself staring at mirrors for too long or instinctively holding my breath when I passed by floral perfume counters in stores. But the worst part, the photo. Remember how I mentioned taking a picture of the carved warning on the chaise lounge? It was still on my phone, and for the first few days, I was too scared to look at it, but curiosity finally got the better of me. Late one night, I opened my gallery and found the image. At first, it looked normal. The carving, "Don't sit here," was clear in the photo, just as I remembered it. But as I zoomed in, I noticed something else. Reflected in the polished wood of the chaise's armrest, there was a faint silhouette. It was small, distorted by the curve of the wood, but it was unmistakably a figure. A woman sitting upright, with her hands clasped together. I stared at the photo until my eyes burned. It was impossible, I told myself. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or a smudge on the surface of the wood. I tried convincing myself of anything that didn't involve what I feared was true, that she had been there even when I didn't see her. In the following days, strange things started happening. It began with the floral scent. I'd smell it out of nowhere, in my bedroom, on the bus, even in my car. It wasn't overpowering, but it lingered like a whisper I couldn't quite catch. Then, the knocking started. It was always the same. 3 soft taps, coming from inside my closet, or at the window, or even, once, from the bathroom mirror. Every time I'd rush to check, there was nothing there, just empty air and the faintest whiff of roses. One night, I woke up to find my phone screen illuminated on my bedside table. The photo of the chaise lounge was open. I didn't remember unlocking my phone, let alone opening the gallery. My heart pounded as I stared at the screen. That's when I noticed the figure in the reflection had moved. She was no longer sitting, she was standing, her veil hanging slightly to one side, and her hand was outstretched, as if reaching toward the camera. I deleted the photo immediately, hoping that would end whatever was happening. It didn't. The following week was a blur of sleepless nights and paranoia. Every shadow seemed to stretch too long, every sound felt too deliberate. I finally decided to contact the Opera House. Maybe, I thought, someone could give me an explanation, or at least reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind. When I called, the manager who answered seemed hesitant to talk. "I'm sorry," they said, "but we can't share too much about that room. There's history there." "What kind of history?" I pressed, my voice shaking. "Look, all I can say is you're not the first person to have issues after working in that room," they admitted. "If you want my advice, just let it go. Don't try to figure it out." I hung up feeling more unsettled than ever, but their words stayed with me. Let it go. Don't try to figure it out. So I didn't. I moved out of my apartment a month later, changed my number, and cut ties with anyone connected to the Opera House. The floral scent stopped following me, and the knocking disappeared. For the first time in weeks, I began to feel normal again, but every now and then, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a faint outline in the reflection of a window, or a shadow that seems too still. And for a split second, I smell roses. Months passed, and life slowly returned to normal. I had almost convinced myself that the entire ordeal was the result of stress stress or some bizarre, overly vivid imagination. But as much as I tried to forget, there was always a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, a subtle fear that the Fatty room wasn't done with me. The final incident happened about a year after I left the opera house. I had moved to a new city and started a fresh chapter of my life. My new apartment was small but cozy, and I was beginning to feel safe again. One night, after a long day at work, I decided to treat myself to some tea and a good book. The world outside was quiet, the kind of peaceful silence that made the air feel heavier. I was halfway through my tea when my phone buzzed. It was strange because I had muted notifications for the night. When I picked it up, there was a single, unread message from an unknown number. The text was short but immediately froze me in place. "Did you forget about me?" My heart dropped. My first thought was that it had to be a prank, some random wrong number. But as I stared at the message, something about it felt too personal, too deliberate. I hesitated before typing back, my hands trembling. "Who is this?" I said. The reply came almost instantly. "You left me in the room." I dropped the phone as if it had burned me. My breathing was shallow, my skin cold with sweat. I didn't want to look at the screen again, but I couldn't stop myself. When I picked it up, there was a third message waiting. "Come back." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spent hours frantically searching the internet for any information I could find about the fainting room. Old articles, forums, even urban legends, anything that might explain what had happened. Most of it was the same, stories about strange noises, phantom smells, and unsettling reflections. But one story caught my eye. It was a thread on an obscure paranormal website, written by someone who claimed to be a former custodian at the opera house. They described the fainting room in eerie detail, including the chaise lounge and the mirror. But it was the last part of their post that made my blood run cold. "Whatever you do, don't sit on the chaise. Don't look into the mirror for too long. And if you hear her speak, never answer. Once she knows your name, she'll never stop looking for you." I slammed my laptop shut. By then, I had signed the messages with my name. The next week was pure hell. The floral scent returned, stronger than ever. They clung to my clothes, my sheets, even my skin. Shadows moved in places they shouldn't, and the soft knocking started again, this time at every window, no matter where I was. Then came the voice. It started as a whisper, so faint I thought I was imagining it. A soft, lilting tone that seemed to drift from the walls. "Why did you leave me?" It would ask, over and over. "Come back." One night, I woke up to find my bedroom bathed in the dim glow of my phone's screen. It was on the floor, the same photo of the chaise lounge open again. Only now, the reflection was clearer than ever. She was there, fully visible, her veil pulled back. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken but piercing, as if she was staring directly at me through the screen. I screamed and threw the phone across the room, shattering the screen. The smell of roses became suffocating, filling every corner of the apartment. And then, for the first time, I heard her voice clearly, right behind me. "Don't you want to see me again?" I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew, it was morning and I was lying on the floor, the shattered phone still beside me. I packed up and left that same day. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not friends, not family. I cut every tie and moved across the country, leaving everything behind. For now, things have been quiet. The scent is gone, the knocking has stopped, and I've managed to rebuild a semblance of a normal life. But sometimes, in the dead of night, I'll catch a whisper in the wind, soft and mournful, calling my name. And every now and then, the faint smell of roses drifts through the air, just for a moment. I work as a freelance graphic designer, and I'm obsessed with stationery, pens, paper, you name it. There's this little stationery store a few blocks from my apartment that carries a lot of niche supplies, so I often go there to restock or just browse. The owner, an older man named Victor, knows me by name and always greets me warmly when I walk in. One quiet Wednesday afternoon, I stopped by the store to pick up some calligraphy ink. Victor wasn't at the counter, which was odd, but I figured he might be in the back room organizing inventory. There was only one other person in the store, a man in his late 40s or early 50s, dressed in a rumpled suit that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. His hair was unkempt, and he was standing unnervingly close to one of the display shelves, muttering to himself under his breath. I tried to ignore him as I browsed, but something about him made me uneasy. His muttering wasn't coherent, just fragments of sentences like they'll see. Both them not yet, not yet. I'm a naturally curious person, but this wasn't something I wanted to investigate further. I quickly grabbed the ink I needed and headed toward the counter, hoping Victor would appear so I wouldn't have to interact with the stranger. As I approached the register, the man suddenly turned and stared directly at me. His eyes were wide and glassy, and he had this unnerving half smile on his face. He didn't say anything, just stood there watching me. I pretended not to notice and set my items on the counter. Still no sign of Victor. "Need help finding anything?" I asked, just to break the silence. I know, I regretted it immediately. The man's smile grew wider. "I've already found what I need," he said, his voice low and almost sing-song. "But thank you." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded and looked around, hoping Victor would magically appear. The store was completely silent, except for the faint buzzing of a fluorescent light above me. Finally, I decided to just leave the money for my ink on the counter and get out of there. As I reached into my bag to grab my wallet, I heard the man's footsteps behind me. "Do you know how this place works?" he asked, his voice closer than I expected. I turned around, and he was standing only a few feet away, holding what looked like a fountain pen in his hand. "You think it's just a store, don't you?" he continued. "But it's not. Not really." "Okay," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I think I'm just going to leave now." I backed toward the door, but he followed me, his smile never wavering. "You can't leave yet," he said. "Not until you know. They don't like it when people leave without knowing." At this point, I was thoroughly freaked out. I grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, fully expecting him to try and stop me. But he didn't. He just stood there, watching me with that eerie smile as I stepped out onto the sidewalk. As the door swung shut behind me, I heard him say, "See you next time." I practically ran home and didn't look back. Later that evening, I called the store to make sure Victor was okay. He picked up on the second ring, and when I asked about the man, he sounded confused. "What man?" he said. "You were the only customer I had all day." A week passed after the incident, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Maybe Victor had just been mistaken or distracted when I called, but his reaction replayed in my head like a broken record. I found myself double-checking locks, glancing over my shoulder, and avoiding the store entirely. But no matter how much I tried to forget, the man's words, "You think it's just a store, don't you? But it's not," kept resurfacing. One night, while working late on a project, my phone buzzed with an email notification. It was from an unknown address, the subject line blank. Against my better judgment, I opened it. The body of the email was short. "Didn't figure it out yet. Time's running out." Attached was a photo of the stationery store, taken at night. The lights inside were on, casting an eerie glow onto the sidewalk. And there, standing at the window, was the man from that day, staring directly into the camera with that same unsettling smile. I froze. How did this person know my email? And why was he contacting me? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, someone messing with me. But the logical part of my brain couldn't explain how the photo looked like it had been taken just moments ago. I glanced at the clock on my laptop. 1:12 a.m. My apartment was quiet, the streets outside even quieter. Every instinct screamed at me to ignore it, to delete the email and go to bed. But instead, I did the one thing I swore I wouldn't. I went back to the store. The walk there felt like a nightmare, my heart pounding in rhythm with my footsteps. The streets were deserted, the only sound the occasional hum of a distant car. When I turned the corner and saw the store, I stopped dead in my tracks. The lights were on, just like in the photo, but the place was supposed to be closed. Victor never stayed open this late. I considered walking away, but something pulled me forward. Curiosity, maybe, or some strange compulsion I couldn't explain. As I approached the storefront, I noticed the display shelves had been rearranged. Everything was in disarray, pens and notebooks scattered like someone had gone through them in a frenzy. And there, in the center of the chaos, was the same fountain pen the man had been holding. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the tiny bell above it jingling weakly. "Victor," I called, my voice trembly. The store was silent. No footsteps, no rustling from the back room, nothing. I took a cautious step forward, and then another. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive. As I reached for the counter, a faint whisper echoed through the space. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again, clear this time. "Not yet, not yet." It was him. I whipped around, expecting to see the man standing behind me, but the store was empty. My eyes darted to the back room door, which was slightly ajar. Against my better judgment, I crept toward it, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The whispers grew louder as I pushed the door open. Inside, the room was bathed in a faint, otherworldly glow. Victor's desk was covered in papers and strange symbols I didn't recognize. On the wall, someone had scrawled words in red ink, or was it something else? They watched through the cracks. Then I saw it, a small, ancient-looking mirror propped against the wall. Its surface rippled like water, and the man's face appeared, staring at me from the other side. His grin widened as he spoke. "Nagdusit." I bolted out of there, slamming the door behind me. I didn't stop running until I was back in my apartment, locking every door and window. That night, I didn't sleep. The mirror's image burned into my mind. The store was boarded up the next day. No explanation, no sign of Victor, and the email, it vanished from my inbox, leaving no trace. I've tried to move on, but sometimes, late at night, I hear whispers coming from my living room. I refuse to look, but I can feel it, the same heavy presence I felt in that back room. I don't know what I saw that night, but one thing is clear, I should have never gone back. I tried everything to distance myself from what happened. Therapy, meditation, even moving to a new apartment on the other side of the city. But no matter where I went, the memories followed me. Worse, the whispers didn't stop. At first, they were faint, like the echo of a dream, but over the weeks, they grew louder, more insistent, always at the edge of my hearing. And the worst part, I started seeing the man. It wasn't like he was standing outside my window or following me down the street. No, it was more subtle than that. I'd catch glimpses of it in reflections, shop windows, car mirrors, even the blank screen of my phone. Always the same unnerving smile, always staring, as if he was waiting for something. The final straw came one night when I was brushing my teeth. I leaned down to rinse my mouth, and when I looked up, he was there in the bathroom mirror. But this time, he wasn't smiling. His expression was one of anger or maybe frustration. His lips moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear. I stumbled backward, knocking over the toothbrush holder and nearly slipping on the tile floor. When I dared to look again, he was gone. The mirror reflected only me, pale and trembling. That night, I didn't sleep. The next morning, I called a friend, Sarah, who's always been the rational one in our group. I told her everything. She didn't laugh or dismiss me like I thought she might. Instead, she listened intently, her brow furrowed. This sounds, I don't know, like something out of a bad horror movie, she said. But if it's real, maybe it's connected to that store. Have you tried going back? Are you kidding me? I nearly shouted. Why would I go back to that place? Sarah shrugged. Because it might be the only way to end this. If he's tied to the store, or whatever you saw in that back room, then maybe facing it is the answer. I hated how much sense that made. The thought of stepping foot in that store again made my skin crawl, but I couldn't keep living like this. The whispers, the sightings, it was too much. So, after a lot of convincing, I agreed. Sarah insisted on coming with me, which gave me a shred of comfort. When we arrived, the store was still boarded up, but the boards looked hastily nailed in place, like someone was more concerned with keeping people out than securing the building. A for-lease sign hung crookedly in the window, but the glow inside was still faintly visible through the cracks. This is it, Sarah asked, peering through the gaps. Doesn't look so scary. Wait until you go inside, I muttered, using a crowbar Sarah had brought. Don't ask me why she owns one. We pried the boards loose and slipped inside. The air was stale, the smell of ink and paper replaced by something metallic and sour. The store was just as I remembered, the scattered supplies, the strange symbols on the walls. But the back room door was gone. What the? I whispered, running my hand over the wall where the door had been. It was seamless, as if the back room had never existed. Sarah frowned but didn't say anything, her flashlight scanning the room. Then we heard it, the whispering. Both of us froze as the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't just random muttering this time. It was a voice, low and gravelly, repeating a single phrase. You shouldn't have come back. Sarah, we need to leave, I said, my voice shaking. But before she could respond, the air around us seemed to shift. The light from Sarah's flashlight flickered, and the shelves began to shake violently, pens and notebooks tumbling to the floor. A deep, guttural laugh echoed through the space. And then he appeared. The man stepped out of the shadows, his eyes gleaming with a sickening light. His smile was wider than ever, stretching impossibly across his face. He raised a hand, and the air grew colder, heavier. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Sarah grabbed my arm and screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the man's laughter. You think you could live, he said, his voice reverberating through the store. You're part of this now. I don't know how we managed to escape. 1 second we were frozen in place, and the next, we were running out the door, the man's laughter following us into the street. When we finally stopped, gasping for breath, Sarah turned to me, her face pale. Never again, she said. I don't care what happens. I've done it. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. I knew she was right. Whatever that place was, whatever I had seen, it wasn't something I could fight or fix. Since that night, the whispers have stopped, and I haven't seen the man again. But every so often, I dream of the store, of its glowing lights in that doorless back room. And in those dreams, I hear his voice, whispering from the darkness, he'll be back. They always come back. I've always loved museums. There's something about the quiet reverence of a place that holds so much history and knowledge. But after what happened last year, I don't know if I can ever step into one again. It started with an invitation to a private tour of a newly discovered section of an old art museum in my city. The gallery had been sealed off for decades, left forgotten behind a wall during renovations in the 1920s. When construction workers accidentally uncovered it, they found it untouched, a perfect time capsule. The museum had invited a select group of members, including me, to see it before it open to the public. The gallery was called the Whispering Wing, and no one could explain the name. It was filled with portraits, mostly of people who were local figures in the 19th century. The curator, a tall woman with a calm but commanding voice, led us through the collection, her flashlight beam dancing over gilded frames and aged faces. These portraits are unique, she said, and unlike many traditional pieces, these were commissioned by individuals of lesser social status. There are no records of the artists, only the subjects. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the paintings. The eyes eyes seemed too lifelike, almost as if they were following us. I told myself it was a trick of the lighting, but I couldn't stop glancing back at them. Halfway through the tour, I noticed something odd. The room wasn't entirely silent. Faint murmurs seemed to drift through the air, just on the edge of perception. I strained to hear, but every time I tried to focus, the whispers faded. Does anyone else hear that? I asked, breaking the curator's monologue. She paused, her expression unreadable. The gallery is known for its acoustics, she said. Sound carries strangely here. No one else in the group seemed concerned, so I let it go. But as we moved deeper into the wing, the whispers grew louder. They were still indistinct, but now they seemed to form words. Leave, one voice hissed. I froze, my heart hammering. I glanced around, but no one else seemed to hear it. As we reached the final room, the whispers grew into a cacophony, though still only I seemed to notice. The room held the largest portrait of all, a woman in a black dress, her face pale and severe. Her eyes seemed sharper than the others, almost alive. The moment I stepped into the room, the whispers stopped. The silence was so sudden it felt like I'd gone deaf. Then, the curator spoke. Legend says this is the last portrait ever painted in the gallery. The subject was unusual. She insisted the artist paint her exactly as she appeared, with no embellishments. Shortly after it was completed, she disappeared. I stared at the painting, and the air felt heavy, oppressive. The woman's gaze was locked on mine, and I couldn't look away. Then, her lips twitched. It was so slight I almost doubted I'd seen it, but I felt it. She smiled, and I stumbled backward, knocking into one of the other guests. They glared at me, but I didn't care. I turned to leave, but the exit wasn't where I remembered it. The gallery seemed to shift, the walls narrowing, the path twisting. I ran, my footsteps echoing louder and louder until they didn't sound like mine anymore. I wasn't alone. A shadow stretched along the walls, too long to be cast by the others in the group. And the whispers, they were screaming now, their words blending into a chaotic roar. Finally, I burst into the main hall, gasping for air. The others filed out behind me, calm and composed, as if nothing had happened. I tried to explain what I'd seen, but no one believed me. I haven't been back to the museum since, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear the whispers again. They're faint, almost like a memory. Since that night, I've tried to move on, but the experience lingers, wrapping itself around my thoughts like a fog. The whispers that followed me out of the museum haven't stopped entirely. At first, they were faint, only audible in the quietest moments, just as I drifted to sleep or while walking alone at night. Over time, they grew more persistent. I thought maybe it was stress, a trick of my mind, trying to process the fear I felt that night, but then I started noticing small, unsettling details. Objects in my apartment would shift slightly when I wasn't looking. A chair that I knew I pushed in would be pulled out. Doors I'd locked would creak open in the middle of the night. The worst was the mirror in my bathroom. I began to avoid it, sensing that something wasn't right. One night, as I brushed my teeth, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. A figure, a pale face with dark, hollow eyes, stood just behind me. My heart stopped, and I spun around, but no one was there. The whispers became clear after that, and their words weren't comforting. They warned me. They taunted me. She's watching. They said, she'll find you. I didn't know who she was at first, but I couldn't stop thinking about the portrait. The woman in black with that cold, knowing smile. I looked her up, hoping to find some explanation, but the museum's website had no record of the Whispery Wing or its collection. When I called to ask, the receptionist sounded confused. There's no gallery by that name, she said. Are you sure you have the right museum? I hung up, shaken. I knew what I'd seen. I still had the invitation, the ticket stub, but it was as if the gallery and that night had been erased. The situation escalated last week. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange noise, a soft tapping at my window. My apartment is on the 5th floor, and there's no fire escape or balcony. My stomach sank as I crept toward the window, heart pounding. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. When I pulled back the curtain, the street below was empty, but pressed against the glass, faint but unmistakable, was the outline of a handprint. It was small and delicate, as if left by a woman's hand. I barely slept that night, and in the morning, I packed a bag and left to stay with a friend. That no matter where I go, the whispers follow. They're louder now, almost constant, and I can feel her presence growing stronger. It's like she's closing in. Last night, I dreamt of the gallery again. The walls were tighter, the shadows deeper. The woman in the portrait was waiting for me, her smile wider now, her eyes filled with a cruel, predatory glee. I told you to leave, she said, her voice blending with the whispers. But you didn't. When I woke up, there was something on my nightstand that hadn't been there before, a small, gilded picture frame. It was empty, but I swear I could feel the edges hum beneath my fingers, like it was alive. I don't know how much longer I could take this. The whispers are louder than ever, and I've started seeing her in the corners of my vision, just for a moment before she disappears. She's not just in my dreams anymore. She's to anyone reading this, if you're ever invited to a private tour of a forgotten gallery or a mysterious museum wing, don't go. No matter how tempting it sounds, no matter how exclusive the invitation, don't do it. I wish I could say that writing this down has made me feel better, better, but it hasn't. If anything, it feels like she knows I'm talking about her. The whispers are louder tonight, overlapping and urgent, as though they're fighting to be heard over each other. She's coming. I've tried to ignore them. I've tried to stay rational, but my attempts to brush this off as paranoia or stress have failed. There's something real happening to me, and I can't explain it. Every light in my apartment is on, but the shadows still seem to creep closer, pulling in corners and under doors. A few hours ago, I decided I couldn't stay here any longer. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, but the moment I touched the handle, the whisper stopped. Completely. It was the most unsettling silence I've ever experienced. My ears rang from the absence of sound, and then I heard her. "Leaving won't help," she said, and her voice was soft but cold, like wind slipping through a crack in a window. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My legs buckled, and I collapsed against the door, my breath shallowed and panicked. She was right. Leaving wouldn't help. I don't know how I know that, but I do. It's like she's tied to me now, like I've somehow invited her into my life. Running won't change anything. She'll follow me, no matter where I go. After that, I tried calling a friend. I didn't want to be alone, but when I dialed their number, all I heard was static. The same happened with every number I tried, even emergency services. It was as if the world outside my apartment had disappeared. I've spent the last few hours sitting in the middle of my living room, trying to convince myself that this is all in my head, but it's not. I can feel her here with me. The air feels heavy, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. The empty picture frame she left on my nightstand, it's no longer empty. When I glanced at it earlier, I saw something new, a faint, shadowy outline of a figure. I didn't dare pick it up, but as I stared at it, the figure seemed to grow clearer. It's her. I know it's her. She's getting closer. A few minutes ago, I noticed something else. The walls of my apartment are they're not solid anymore. The paint is peeling away, revealing something beneath it. It looks like old wood paneling, the same kind I saw in the whispery wing. I can hear footsteps now, soft and deliberate. They're coming from the hallway outside my door. I don't know how she's doing it, but she's here. She's here, and I don't know how to stop her. If you're reading this, please don't ignore my warning. Don't go looking for the whispery wing. Don't try to learn more about the woman in the portrait. I don't know what she is, but she's not human. She's not something you can understand or escape from. The footsteps have stopped. There's a shadow under the door, and it's not moving. I think she's waiting for me to open it. The whispers have started again, louder than ever, and now they're all saying the same thing. Let her in. I won't. I can't. But I'm not sure how much longer I can hold out. If I don't make it through this, please remember my story. Let me preface this by saying that I'm not the kind of person who believes in the paranormal or weird happenings. I work a desk job, I live a pretty boring life, and I'm usually in bed by 10. But something happened to me last month that I haven't been able to shake, and I thought maybe putting it here would help me move on. I was visiting a small town for work, just a quick weekend trip to meet with a client. The town itself was picturesque, surrounded by dense forest, with cobblestone streets and little shops lining the main drag. My meeting had gone well, and I had a few hours before my train home, so I decided to explore. I came across a quaint cafe tucked into the corner of a narrow side street. The sign hanging above the door read "The Last Stop." It looked charming, with potted plants and street lights around the window. Inside, it was cozy with mismatched furniture, a small fireplace, and the faint scent of coffee and baked goods. A few people sat at tables, quietly chatting or reading. I ordered a coffee and a scone from a woman behind the counter. She was older, with a warm smile and a lilting accent I couldn't place. As I sat down by the window, she brought my order over and said, "Enjoy your visit." The way she said it struck me as odd, like she knew something I didn't. I spent a good hour there, reading emails and sipping my coffee. The scone was delicious, crumbly and sweet, and the coffee was better than anything I'd had in a long time. I started to wonder why this place wasn't packed. Surely it was the kind of spot locals would rave about. When I went to pay, the woman shook her head. "It's already taken care of," she said. "A gift." I didn't argue. I left a tip and thanked her, feeling a little puzzled but grateful. Outside, the afternoon sun was starting to dip, casting long shadows across the street. I turned back to take a picture of the cafe. It was exactly the kind of place my friend Sarah would love to hear about. But when I turned around, the cafe was gone. The corner where it had been was now occupied by a boarded up building, its windows grimy and cracked. The sign above the door was faded and illegible. I walked up to it, heart pounding, and peered inside. Dust covered every surface, and the chairs were stacked haphazardly on the tables. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. I asked a passerby, a middle-aged man walking a dog, about the cafe. He gave me a strange look and said, "That place has been closed since I was a kid. It used to be called The Last Stop, but no one's been in there for decades." I didn't sleep much that night, replaying the entire experience in my head. I could still taste the coffee and feel the warm atmosphere of the cafe. It had felt so real. I went back to the town last week, determined to find some explanation. The building was still boarded up, just as it had been when I left. I asked around, but no one seemed to know anything more. I couldn't leave it alone. The memory of The Last Stop lingered like the aftertaste of its perfect coffee. It was the little details that haunted me, the way the fireplace crackled, the warm wood of the tables, the faint hum of conversation. It felt too vivid to dismiss as a trick of my mind. A few nights ago, I decided to dig deeper. I scoured online archives and forums, hoping to find something about the cafe's history. After hours of fruitless searching, I stumbled upon a blog post from nearly 15 years ago. It was written by a woman describing a similar experience, visiting a cozy little cafe called The Last Stop in the same small town. She raved about the coffee and scones, only to realize later that the building had been abandoned for decades. Her post ended with a cryptic warning: "If you find yourself at The Last Stop, don't stay too long. Not everyone makes it back." That was enough to chill me to the bone, but I couldn't stop reading. I found other mentions of the cafe scattered across the internet, buried in forums, hidden in comment threads. Each account described the same cozy atmosphere, the same mysterious woman behind the counter, and the same eerie realization afterward. But what stood out to me was how the stories differed in one key way. Not everyone experienced the same timeline. One person said they had visited the cafe in the 1980s, while another claimed it appeared to them in the 1920s. Yet the descriptions of the interior and the woman were consistent across decades. I also noticed something else that made my stomach drop. Most of the posts ended abruptly, with no follow-up comments or updates from the original authors. It was as if they'd simply vanished after sharing their story. By now, my curiosity had shifted into full-blown fear. I wasn't just dealing with a strange experience, I was part of a pattern, a dangerous one. Then, last night, I woke up at 3 a.m. to the smell of coffee. It was faint but unmistakable, drifting through my apartment. My heart started to race as I sat up in bed, straining to hear any sounds. Nothing. I checked every corner of my apartment, but it was empty. Just as I was convincing myself I'd imagined it, I noticed something on my kitchen counter. It was a scone, crumbly and sweet smelling, just like the one I'd had at The Last Stop. I didn't touch it. I grabbed my keys and spent the rest of the night in my car, parked outside a 24-hour diner. When I finally returned home this morning, the scone was gone. I don't know what to do. I don't know what The Last Stop is or why it chose me, but I'm terrified it's not done with me yet. The smell of coffee lingers in my apartment, faint but persistent, like a reminder. After the incident with the scone, I felt like I was being watched. Not in the overt, someone peering in your window way, but in the subtle, ever-present sense that something was aware of me. The smell of coffee, sometimes faint, sometimes stronger, became a recurring presence in my apartment, no matter how many windows I opened or how much I scrubbed. Then, the dreams started. At first, they were vague. I'd find myself sitting at a table in The Last Stop, the crackling fireplace and low murmur of voices around me. The woman behind the counter would give me that same warm smile and say, "Enjoy your visit." Then I'd wake up, my heart pounding and my sheets damp with sweat. But the dreams became more detailed and more unsettling. In one, the cafe was empty, the cozy warmth replaced by a cold, oppressive silence. The fireplace was extinguished, and the tables and chairs were covered in a thick layer of dust. The woman was still there, but her smile was gone. She stood motionless behind the counter, staring at me with empty eyes. In the most recent dream, she spoke. "You shouldn't have left," she whispered, her voice echoing as if the cafe was much larger than it appeared. "You're still a guest." When I woke up, there was a business card on my nightstand that hadn't been there before. It was plain, with black text that read, "The Last Stop. We're always here when you need us." There was no phone number, no address, just the cryptic phrase and the faint smell of coffee lingering on the card. I decided to confide in my friend Sarah, the one who I'd originally thought would love the cafe. Sarah is practical to a fault, the kind of person who keeps you grounded. I needed someone like that to tell me I was imagining things. When I explained everything to her, she looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "You're not the first person I've heard mention this place," she said finally. "My grandmother used to talk about a cafe like that. She said it was where people went when they were lost, not physically, but emotionally, like when they didn't know where else to turn." "What does that mean?" I asked, feeling a chill run down my spine. Sarah shrugged. "I don't know. She always said it was a dangerous place, though, like, if you stayed too long, you forget why you ever wanted to leave." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept the lights on and sat at my kitchen table, staring at the business card. Around 3 a.m., the same time I'd smelled the coffee before, I heard a faint knock at my door. I froze. It wasn't a loud knock, more like a gentle tap, like someone was testing whether I was awake. My apartment is on the 3rd floor, and there's a security door downstairs, so it didn't make sense for anyone to be there. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. I got up slowly, my heart pounding. Against my better judgment, I peered through the peephole. There was no one there, but on the floor in front of my door, there was a small white envelope. I hesitated before opening the door, quickly grabbing the envelope and slamming it shut again. Inside was a single slip of paper that read, "It's time to come back. I don't know what to do. I'm afraid if I ignore it, something worse will happen. But I also can't bring myself to go looking for the last stop again." I used to work for a small marina on the northern coast, the kind of place that sees more seagulls than people in the off-season. My job was to maintain the docks, check the boats, and help with the occasional winter storm prep. It was quiet, repetitive work, which suited me just fine. One night in January, I was closing up. A gale was rolling in, and I was the last one on duty. I did my usual rounds, locked the storage shed, secured the lifeboats, and double-checked the fuel pumps. The wind howled, the waves slapped against the pilings, and the cold was biting. I was eager to leave. As I was about to lock the harbor master's office, a squat, windowless building at the far end of the dock, I heard a metallic clatter behind me. I turned and saw a set of keys lying on the wooden planks. They weren't mine. I picked them up, examining the bundle. It was old, with rusted edges and an oversized brass key unlike anything we used at the marina. Our locks were modern. This thing looked like it belonged in a medieval castle. Thinking one of my coworkers had dropped it earlier, I pocketed the keys and headed to the parking lot. That's when I noticed something odd. My car's headlights were on. I always locked my car, but when I got closer, I saw that the driver's door was slightly ajar. My stomach dropped. I scanned the lot, but it was empty except for the wind-blown trash swirling around. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. Nothing seemed disturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. I drove home, but the keys weighed on my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about them. Who did they belong to? How had they ended up on the dock? That night, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I heard a faint jingling sound. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear over the wind outside. It came again, closer this time. It wasn't just the wind. Someone or something was outside my door. I tiptoed to the window and peeked out, but the street was empty. Then I saw it, the faint glow of a flashlight moving along the side of my house. I froze, my mind racing. My first thought was to call the police, but then the jingling stopped and everything went silent. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching a baseball bat, but nothing else happened. The next day at work, I mentioned the keys to my boss. He frowned and told me to bring them in. When I showed him the set, he went pale. "These are the old harbor master's keys," he said. "We haven't used these in decades. They were supposed to have been buried with them." "Buried?" I asked, incredulous. He nodded. "The harbor master before me passed away 20 years ago. When he retired, he was obsessed with those keys. Said they opened doors that shouldn't be opened. After he died, we locked them in his casket as per his instructions." I laughed nervously, thinking he was joking, but the look on his face told me he wasn't. That evening, I drove to the cemetery where the old harbor master was buried. I don't know what I was expecting to find, but I needed answers. As I approached his grave, my headlights illuminated the site, and my blood ran cold. The ground was freshly disturbed. The grave was open, and inside, the casket lid was splintered, as though it had been broken from the inside. I didn't stick around to investigate. I threw the keys as far as I could into the marsh and drove home, shaking. I wish I could say that was the end of it. That tossing the keys into the marsh severed whatever strange link had been forged that night. But the truth is, it only seemed to make things worse. The jingling didn't stop at night. I sat in my bedroom, every light in the house blazing, my back pressed against the wall. The sound moved from room to room, deliberate, almost taunting. I gripped the baseball bat, my hands trembling. Then came the whispering. At first, it was so faint I thought I was imagining it. But as the minutes stretched on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't one voice, it was several. They overlapped, their words unintelligible but urgent, like people arguing just out of earshot. The air felt heavy, oppressive, and my chest tightened as though something was pressing down on me. "Leave," one voice hissed. It was the first word I could make out, and it was unmistakable, clear, commanding, and close. I didn't need to be told twice. I grabbed my car keys and bolted for the door, not even bothering to pack a bag. The moment I stepped outside, the wind picked up, howling so violently I could barely stay on my feet. The trees around my house swayed wildly, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. I made it to my car and sped off, not looking back. I drove aimlessly for hours, unsure where to go. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in my rearview mirror, a shadow darting across the road, something pale and spectral in the distance. But when I looked directly, there was nothing there. Eventually, I pulled into a motel off the highway, exhausted and desperate for rest. The clerk gave me a key, and I trudged to my room, collapsing onto the bed without even taking off my shoes. That's when I heard it again, the jingling. It was faint at first, like before, but it quickly grew louder, more insistent. My heart sank as I realized it wasn't coming from outside, it was inside the room. I sat up, scanning the dimly lit space. keys. The keys. They were sitting on the desk. The same old, rusted keys I had thrown into the marsh hours earlier. I couldn't breathe as my mind raced, trying to make sense of it. There was no way they could have followed me. No way. Before I could react, the air grew icy and the lights flickered. The whispers returned, louder than ever, surrounding me, filling the room. The walls seemed to close in, and the keys began to jingle on their own, rattling violently against the desk. I grabbed them, not knowing what else to do, and the moment my fingers touched the cold metal, everything stopped. The whispers, the flickering lights, the oppressive air, all of it vanished, leaving me in eerie silence. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was the kind that makes your skin crawl, the kind that feels like you're being watched. I don't remember falling asleep that night, but when I woke up, the keys were gone. It's been months since that night, and I've moved far from the marina, far from the grave, far from everything that happened, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Every now and then, I hear faint jingling in the distance. When I do, I lock every door, turn on every light, and pray it doesn't find me again. For a while, I thought I could move on. I convinced myself it was over, that I had somehow escaped whatever had latched onto me. But it wasn't long before the sign started again. It began with the dreams. They weren't like regular dreams. They felt real, too real. In them, I was always standing at the marina, staring out at the black water under a moonless sky. The waves didn't move, the air didn't stir. It was dead silent, and in every dream, I'd hear the jingling, faint at first, then louder, echoing around me. When I turned to look, there was always a figure standing on the far end of the dock, just out of reach of the light. I couldn't make out its features, just a tall, shadowy form, unnaturally still. It didn't speak, didn't move, it just watched. But the worst part was its eyes. Even in the dark, I could see them dull, empty, and unblinking. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the sound of the jingling still ringing in my ears. No matter how far I moved, how many locks I added to my doors, the dreams followed me, the figure followed me, and then the dream started bleeding into reality. One night, I came home from work to find my apartment door unlocked. I knew I had locked it before I left. I always double checked. My stomach churned as I pushed it open, half expecting to find my place ransacked. But everything was untouched, exactly as I'd left it, except for the keys. They were sitting on my kitchen counter, perfectly arranged, as though someone had deliberately placed them there. I stood frozen in the doorway, my pulse hammering in my ears. I didn't even bother going inside. I grabbed my phone, called the police, and waited on the sidewalk until they arrived. The officers searched the apartment but found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing. When I showed them the keys and tried to explain their significance, they looked at me like I was crazy. One of them suggested I might have just misplaced them, but I knew better. I didn't even own those keys. After that, I stopped sleeping at home. I hopped between motels, sleepy with the lights on, but it didn't help. The keys kept finding me. Sometimes they'd show up on my nightstand. Other times, they'd be in my bag or my car. It didn't matter how far I ran or how many times I threw them away, they always came back. And then the figure started appearing. At first, it was just glimpses, a shadow at the edge of my vision, a shape standing under a flickering street light, but it was never close enough for me to see it clearly. It stayed just out of reach, always watching, always waiting. One night, I woke up to find it standing at the foot of my bed. I couldn't move, I couldn't scream. I just lay there, paralyzed, as it loomed over me. Its eyes were the same as in the dreams, dull, lifeless, and utterly wrong. It didn't say anything. It didn't need to. The weight of its presence was suffocating, and I knew deep down that it wanted something from me. The keys. I don't know how I knew, but I did. It wanted the keys, but I didn't have them. They hadn't showed up that night, and I had no idea where they were. As if it could hear my thoughts, the figure tilted its head, its shadowy form rippling like smoke, and then, without a sound, it vanished. I haven't seen it since, but the keys still haunt me. Every now and then, they reappear, always in a place I couldn't possibly have put them. I've tried everything, burning them, burying them, even throwing them into the ocean, but they always come back. I don't know what they unlock, and I'm terrified to find out. All I know is that whatever is tied to them isn't done with me yet. If you ever find a set of old, rusted keys lying somewhere they don't belong, leave them alone, walk away, and pray you don't hear the jingling in the night. A few months ago, I signed up for a bookbinding class at a small studio in the arts district. It seemed like a cozy, creative way to spend my Saturday mornings. The studio itself was beautiful, dimly lit but warm, with walls lined by wooden shelves holding rows of antique tools, jars of glue, and stacks of paper. It smelled of leather and parchment, a scent I found oddly comforting. There were 6 of us in the class, plus the instructor, an older woman named Alina who seemed friendly, if a little eccentric. She spoke softly but firmly, explaining the intricate steps to stitch spines and bind exam covers. One Saturday, about halfway through the 6-week course, a leader mentioned she had an extensive collection of vintage books in a storage room at the back of the workshop. She invited anyone interested to come take a look after class. I was intrigued. I'd always loved antique books, so I stayed behind, and Leader led me to a heavy door at the far end of the workshop. It creaked ominously as she unlocked it with an old-fashioned key. The room beyond was much colder than the rest of the studio, and the air had a musty, metallic tang. Inside were stacks of books piled haphazardly, some in cabinets, others on the floor. As I stepped further into the room, a leader mentioned that these books were part of her personal collection. They were unfinished projects left behind by previous students. She said they'd been abandoned over the years for various reasons, people dropping out of the class, moving away, or just losing interest. Something about the way she said abandoned sent a small shiver up my spine. I walked to one of the shelves and picked up a particularly weathered book. Its spine was loose, the cover made of some kind of cracked, dark leather. As I opened it, I noticed the pages weren't blank. They were covered in small, cramped handwriting. Strange phrases filled each page, written in ink that looked too dark, almost black-red. Some of the words seemed to repeat, "Leave the door closed. Do not open the door." I felt a leader's eyes on me and hastily put the book back. "Did one of your students write that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual, and Leader tilted her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "Not exactly." Before I could ask what she meant, she gestured toward another shelf. "There are some fascinating ones over here," she said, her voice calm and even. "I think you'd find them illuminating." Something about her choice of words made my skin crawl. I glanced at the books on the shelf and noticed that several had names written on their spines, names of people. Some of them matched the attendance sheet a leader kept in the studio for current students. My stomach churned as a thought struck me. Were these the unfinished projects? I muttered an excuse about needing to get going and made my way quickly to the door. The leader didn't try to stop me, but as I left, she called after me, "You'll come back, won't you? I'd hate for your project to end up back here." I didn't answer. I didn't go back for the remaining weeks of the course. I didn't even email a leader to explain my absence. A few days ago, I found a package on my doorstep. Inside was a book, bound in dark leather and marked with my name on the spine. After receiving the package, I tried to convince myself it was just some strange, overly intense gesture from a leader, maybe a way of nudging me to finish the class. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. I hadn't left any work unfinished at the studio. The only thing I'd worked on was a simple notebook, and I'd already taken it home. The book on my doorstep is not my work. It sat on my kitchen counter for 2 days, wrapped in plain brown paper. I didn't know what to do with it. Part of me wanted to throw it out, but another part, an irrational but nagging part, was terrified of what might happen if I did. I told myself it was just a book, but my chest tightened every time I walked past it. On the third night, curiosity got the better of me. I carefully unwrapped the paper, revealing the same dark leather cover I'd seen in Alina's storage room. My name was etched into the spine in gold, the lettering flawless and elegant. With trembling hands, I opened it. The first few pages were blank. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and flipped through, hoping to find what? Proof that this was some elaborate joke. Evidence that a leader wasn't as unsettling as she seemed. Then I reached a page filled with writing. It wasn't my handwriting, but the words were familiar. They were mine, a passage I'd written in a journal years ago about a dream I'd had that left me shaken for days. The details were exact, down to the description of the shadowy figure standing at the foot of my bed. I kept turning pages, and more of my private thoughts stared back at me. Diary entries, notes I'd scribbled in old notebooks, even a letter I'd written to my late grandmother but never sent. I felt exposed, like someone had torn through the most vulnerable corners of my mind and stitched them together on these pages. And then I saw something worse. Toward the back of the book, the writing changed. It wasn't mine anymore. It was a list. My name was at the top, followed by 5 others. I recognized some of them. They were the other students in a leader's class. 2 names had been crossed out, and next to them were dates. One of the dates was from 2 months ago. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Were these the unfinished projects a leader had mentioned? What had happened to the people whose names were crossed out? The last entry on the list was blank, no date, no line through it, but it was my name. I slammed the book shut and shoved it back into its paper wrapping. I wanted to get rid of it, but I couldn't just throw it away. What if someone else found it? What if it came back to me? The next day, I drove to the edge of town to a secluded spot by the river. I brought the book with me, along with a canister of lighter fluid. I doused the book and lit a match, watching as the flames consumed it. The leather cover curled and blackened, and the pages disintegrated into ash. I felt a wave of relief as the last ember died out. I thought it was over, but last night, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against my front door. When I went to check, there was nothing there, just a faint, musty smell in the air, like old paper. This morning, I found another package on my doorstep, smaller this time, and inside was a single page, charred at the edges. My name was at the top, with today's date written underneath. I didn't sleep last night. I kept the lights on in every room, pacing and checking my windows every few minutes. It didn't feel like I was alone. There was no reason for me to feel that way, no footsteps, no whispers, but the silence felt heavier than it should have. Around 3 a.m., I heard a faint tapping sound. I froze, listening carefully. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone knocking softly but persistently. It wasn't coming from the door this time. It was coming from the window. I told myself not to look. I told myself to grab my phone and call someone, anyone, but my legs moved on their own. I found myself standing in front of the window, heart pounding, staring at the closed blinds. I didn't pull them back. Instead, I stood there, breathing shallowly, straining to hear. The tapping stopped, and for a moment, there was nothing but the thundering of my pulse in my ears. Then a voice whispered my name. It wasn't loud, it wasn't harsh, but it was unmistakable. The voice was Alina's. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over myself as I grabbed my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial 911. The operator answered, but before I could explain, the voice came again, louder this time. Open the door, I screamed, dropping my phone as something thudded against the front door. Not a knock this time, a heavy, deliberate thud, like someone was slamming their shoulder against it. I backed into the kitchen, grabbing the biggest knife I could find. My phone lay on the floor in the living room. The operator's voice faint but panicked as she tried to get my attention. The banging on the door grew louder. I could hear wood splintering, the lock straining under the pressure. I clenched the knife in my hand, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I didn't know where to go. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The silence was worse. I stood there, knife in hand, my entire body trembling, waiting for something, anything, to happen. After what felt like hours, I crept toward the front door. The lock was still intact, though the wood around it was splintered and cracked. I pressed my ear to the door, listening for any sign of movement outside. Nothing. I don't know what possessed me to open the door, but I did. There was no one there, just the faint smell of that same musty paper carried on the cold night air. But something was on the ground in front of the door. Another book. I didn't touch it. I didn't even try to look at it. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and grabbed my phone, finally telling the operator everything that had happened. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. By then, the book was gone. I told them everything, from the strange storage room at Alina's studio to the package on my doorstep. I could tell they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to stress or a prank gone too far, but they agreed to check the area and file a report. I haven't gone back to my house since that night. I'm staying with a friend in another city, trying to piece together what's happening and why. But no matter where I go, I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. That Alina, or whatever this is, isn't done with me yet. The worst part, this morning, I found a piece of paper slipped under my friend's door. It had my name on it, written in that same dark, cramped handwriting. The message was short, just 4 words. You can't burn this. My cousin and I were visiting my grandparents in the rural town where they lived, and on a particularly hot afternoon, we decided to go swimming. My grandparents had mentioned a swimming hole about 2 miles down a dirt road, nestled in a secluded part of the woods. They said it wasn't well known anymore. People in the area preferred the community pool, but it used to be popular when they were younger. Perfect, we thought. Quiet, refreshing, and away from the small town gossip that seemed to follow my cousin and me wherever we went. The trail leading to the swimming hole was overgrown but manageable, and we chatted about nothing in particular as we hiked. After about half an hour, we found it, a small, clear pool surrounded by smooth rocks. It looked just like the kind of hidden gem you find on a postcard. We swam for a while, joking and splashing each other until we were both tired. My cousin pulled herself onto the edge of the rocks and lay there, soaking up the sun, while I floated on my back in the cool water. That's when I noticed something odd. On the far side of the pool, there was a narrow stretch of rocky shoreline. It was hard to see clearly from where I was, but I thought I saw something move in the trees just beyond it. I squinted, trying to make out what it was, a deer maybe, but it didn't move like an animal. I called out to my cousin, "Do you see that?" She propped herself up on her elbows and followed my gaze. "See what?" I pointed toward the trees, but by the time she looked, the movement had stopped. She rolled her eyes. "It's probably a bird or something." I wanted to believe her, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I decided to get out of the water and dry off, but as I climbed onto the rocks, I saw it again, this time closer. It was a person. They were crouched low, partially obscured by the trees, but unmistakably human. I froze, my heart racing, and whispered to my cousin, "There's someone over there." Her eyes widened as she looked where I was pointing. For a second, she didn't say anything. Then, in a voice that was barely audible, she said, "Get your stuff. We're leaving." We grabbed our towels and shoes and started walking back toward the trail. I tried to act casual, like we hadn't noticed anything, but every nerve in my body was screaming at me to run. Halfway back to the main road, we heard footsteps behind us. They weren't rushed, just slow and deliberate, matching our pace. We glanced at each other, panic etched across both our faces. Without a word, we broke into to a sprint, crashing through the underbrush until we reached the dirt road. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, we looked back. No one was there. We told my grandparents what happened, and they immediately called the local sheriff. He sent a deputy to check the area, but they didn't find anyone. The next day, my grandfather mentioned something that chilled me to the bone. He said that years ago, a man had been caught living near that swimming hole, hiding out after escaping from prison. They thought he'd been caught or moved on, but hearing our story made my grandfather wonder if someone else had taken up residence there. Needless to say, we never went back. About a week after the incident at the swimming hole, things started to feel normal again. My cousin and I had tried to shake off the unease, chalking it up to some local loner or a hunter who gotten too close. But deep down, neither of us could completely let it go. On the last night of our visit, my grandparents threw a small cookout in the backyard. Their property bordered the same woods where the swimming hole was located, but the house itself was far enough away that we didn't give it much thought. It was one of those warm summer evenings where the air is thick with the smell of grilling food, and the cicadas provide a constant hum in the background. My cousin and I were sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the trees, when we noticed something strange. There was a faint glint of light coming from the edge of the woods. At first, I thought it was just fireflies, but the glint was steady, too steady to be a bug. It flickered, then disappeared, only to reappear a few feet to the left. I nudged my cousin. "Do you see that?" She squinted, then froze. "Yep." "What is it?" It didn't take long for both of us to realize it was a reflection. Someone was holding something shiny, like a piece of glass or metal, and moving it deliberately to catch the light. "Don't freak out," my cousin whispered. "Let's just go inside." We stood up and walked back into the house, trying to act normal. Once we were inside, we locked the door and pulled the curtains. My grandparents noticed something was up and asked what was wrong. When we told them, my grandfather grabbed his flashlight and headed outside to investigate. He was gone for about 10 minutes, and when he came back, his face was pale. He didn't say much, just muttered something about not wanting to worry us and suggested we all call it a night. But later that evening, as my cousin and I were lying in bed, we heard him talking to my grandmother in the kitchen. He was trying to whisper, but the walls in the old house were thin. There was someone out there, he said, footprints near the tree line. Whoever it was, they were watching us. My heart sank. I could feel my cousin tense up beside me. The next morning, my grandfather called the sheriff again. This time, they took it more seriously. The deputy came out with a tracking dog, and while they didn't find anyone, they did confirm that someone had been on the property. They found fresh footprints in a small pile of cigarette butts near the tree line. The deputy suggested it could have been a drifter or someone camping out in the woods, but my grandparents weren't convinced. They decided to install motion-activated lights around the property and a new lock on the gate at the end of their driveway. My cousin and I left the next day, and though we were relieved to get back to the city, the memory of those woods lingered. I kept wondering who that person was and what they wanted. Were they just curious? Or did they have other intentions? A few months later, my grandmother called to tell me that the lights had gone off one night. My grandfather went out to check and found nothing, but the next morning, they discovered fresh footprints leading from the gate to the edge of the yard. Whoever it was had been there again. That was the last time it happened, as far as I know, but I still think about it whenever I visit. Those woods, once just another part of my childhood summers, feel different now. After the summer incident, I made a conscious effort to avoid thinking about it. Life went on, and I didn't visit my grandparents' house for another couple of years. When I finally did, it was for a family reunion. The gathering brought people from all over, filling the house with laughter and chaos. It was enough to make me forget about the uneasy memories of that last summer. The reunion took place in early fall. The air was crisp, and the woods surrounding my grandparents' property had started to take on fiery shades of orange and red. Despite the cheerful atmosphere, I couldn't help but feel a twinge of anxiety when I looked out toward the tree line. It was too quiet. The first night of the reunion passed without incident. The second, however, was a different story. Around 11 p.m., I was lying in bed, scrolling on my phone. My cousin, yes, the same one from before, was in the room with me, already asleep. Most of the house had gone quiet, save for the occasional murmur of voices from downstairs where a few relatives were still chatting. That's when I heard it, a faint tapping sound. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but it was steady. At first, I thought it was just a branch brushing against the window, but when I got up to look, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A handprint. It wasn't fresh, but it was there, pressed against the outside of the glass, smeared slightly as if whoever left it had dragged their fingers downward. The window was on the second floor. I stepped back quickly, my pulse pounding in my ears. The tapping had stopped, but now I was too terrified to move. I wanted to wake my cousin, but I didn't want to make a sound. Instead, I crept to the door, cracked it it open and listened. That's when I heard footsteps, not inside the house, but outside, below the window, slow and deliberate, crunching softly on the fallen leaves. I froze, straining to hear more. The footsteps circled the house, pausing periodically before continuing. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I woke my cousin and told her what I'd seen and heard. She was groggy and confused at first, but when I pointed out the handprint, she snapped awake. "We need to tell someone," she whispered. We crept downstairs to find my grandfather, who was sitting in the kitchen with my uncle. When we told them what had happened, they didn't hesitate. My grandfather grabbed his shotgun, and my uncle grabbed a flashlight. They stepped outside while my cousin and I stayed inside with my grandmother, who tried to reassure us. They were gone for what felt like an eternity. When they finally came back, their expressions were grim. My uncle had found a series of footprints leading from the woods to the side of the house, directly below our window. What was even more unsettling was what they found near the base of the tree closest to the house, a small, tattered notebook. Inside were random, disjointed notes, names, dates, and vague descriptions of people. One page stood out. Written in shaky handwriting were the words, "The girls in the upstairs room." My grandfather called the sheriff again, but by the time they arrived, whoever had been outside was long gone. The footprints disappeared back into the woods, and the notebook didn't have any identifying information. That was the last time I stayed at my grandparents' house overnight. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in broad daylight. My grandparents eventually moved into town, and the house was sold to someone else. To this day, I wonder if they ever saw the person in the woods, or if the person ever came back. This happened when I was in college, during my final year of architecture school. Our campus was known for its sprawling, modern buildings and, oddly enough, an ancient clock tower at its center. Despite its prominence, the clock tower had been non-functional for years. It wasn't an iconic, romantic clock tower. It was grimy, slightly crooked, and unremarkable except for the strange way it stood in contrast to the sleek design of everything else. One night, I stayed late in the studio. Deadlines were looming, and my partner, Clara, had bailed on me around 11 p.m., leaving me to finalize our model on my own. By the time I packed up my things and left the studio, it was close to 2 a.m. Our campus was usually lively, even at night, but not this late. The paths were silent, the lampposts flickering, and I was the only person in sight. I slung my bag over my shoulder and headed across the quad. The clock tower loomed to my right. That's when I noticed something strange. The clock had moved. For as long as I could remember, the hands had been stuck at 12:07. But now, as I glanced up, the time read 2:03, eerily close to the actual time. My heart skipped. I stopped walking and stared at it, wondering if someone had finally fixed it. Maybe it wasn't broken at all. Maybe it was some kind of art installation meant to sync with specific moments. As I stood there, the second hand began to tick. I swear I heard the sound, soft, rhythmic, like a distant metronome. And then it wasn't distant anymore. I realized I could hear it loud and clear, as though I were standing next to the clock's inner mechanism. Tick, tick, tick. I looked around the quad, hoping someone else was nearby, but it was empty. I decided to keep moving. It was late, and I was tired. Maybe I'd hallucinated the sound. I told myself I'd check it out the next day in the daylight. The ticking followed me. It was faint at first, blending into the rustle of the wind, but as I walked, it grew louder. It wasn't in my head. It was real. I could hear it behind me, matching my pace. I turned sharply, half expecting to see someone holding a pocket watch or some elaborate prankster with a hidden speaker. No one was there, but as soon as I turned, the ticking stopped. I stood frozen for what felt like minutes, scanning the empty paths, trying to control the pounding of my heart. Then I heard it again, not behind me this time, above. I looked up at the clock tower. Its face glowed faintly in the moonlight, and I could see the hands still ticking forward. But there was something else. A shadow, or maybe a figure, moved behind the clock face, visible only because of the faint glow behind the glass. I told myself it had to be a maintenance worker or an art student pulling some elaborate stunt. But I didn't believe it. The figure wasn't moving like a person. It was jerky, almost mechanical, and seemed to phase in and out of sight, like a stuttery film reel. I didn't wait to find out more. I read. The ticking grew louder as I sprinted, echoing in my ears, even as I put more distance between me and the tower. By the time I reached the dorms and slammed the door behind me, my chest felt like it would explode. I pressed my back against the door, trying to steady my breathing, but the sound wouldn't leave me. It was faint, but it was still there. Tick, tick, tick. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I told a friend about what had happened. They looked at me like I'd lost it and insisted the clock hadn't worked in years. When I tried to show them, we walked to the quad together, but the hands were frozen at 12:07 again, just like they'd always been. I've avoided the clock tower ever since. I don't know what I saw or heard, but I still get chills whenever I pass it. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I swear I can still hear it. Tick, tick, tick. After that night, things got strange, not all at once, but in subtle, unnerving ways that made me second guess myself. The ticking didn't stop when I avoided the clock tower. In fact, it seemed to find me no matter where I was. In the library, I'd hear it faintly between the shelves. At the cafe, it would blend into the sound of spoons clinking against mugs, barely noticeable until I was listening for it. Even in the studio, where the buzz of fluorescent lights and the hum of conversation should have drowned it out, it was there, soft and persistent. Tick, tick, tick. I stopped telling people about it after a while. No one believed me, and the more I tried to explain, the crazier I sounded. Clara joked that I was cracking under the stress of finals, but when she started picking up my slack in our projects, I could tell she was worried. Then, one night, it escalated. I was walking back to my dorm after a late night study session. It had been a quiet evening. I hadn't heard the ticking all day, and for the first time in weeks, I felt almost normal. The quad was deserted, as usual, and the clock tower stood dark and silent in the distance. I kept my head down and my pace brisk, eager to get inside and crash. But as I passed the tower, I felt it, a shift in the air, like the kind of pressure change you feel before a storm. And then I heard it. Tick, tick, tick. It wasn't fate this time. It was loud, almost deafening, like the gears of a giant machine grinding against each other. I froze, my heart pounding, and looked up at the clock tower. The hands were moving again, but they weren't ticking forward. They were spinning backward, faster and faster, until they were a blur. And then I saw it. The shadowy figure behind the clock face wasn't a shadow anymore. It was real, tangible, a dark, humanoid form that seemed to writhe and pulse like it was made of smoke. It moved erratically, slamming against the glass as if it were trying to break free. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. All I could do was stare as the figure pressed against the inside of the clock face, its features becoming clearer with each passing second. It didn't have a face, just a smooth, black void where its features should have been, but I felt like it was staring directly at me. And then it spoke. It wasn't a voice, exactly. It was a vibration, a low, guttural hum that I felt in my chest more than I heard with my ears. The words were indistinct, like a language I didn't understand, but the meaning was clear. Time doesn't belong to you. The glass of the clock face began to crack, spiderwebbing outward from where the figure was pressing against it. I finally found the strength to move and bolted, running faster than I ever thought possible. I didn't stop until I reached my dorm, where I locked the door and collapsed on the floor, shaking and gasping for breath. The next day, the clock tower was cordoned off with caution tape. Rumors spread that a structural issue had been discovered and it was unsafe, but no one seemed to know the details. When I asked around, a professor told me that the clock tower was scheduled for demolition. I should have felt relieved, but I didn't. The ticking didn't stop, even after the tower was torn down. It followed me for the rest of the semester, faint and intermittent, like a distant reminder. I graduated and moved away, but every now and then, I still hear it, soft, rhythmic, and impossible to ignore. Tick, tick, tick. After graduation, I tried to put the whole thing behind me. I moved to a new city, got a job at a design firm, and focused on building a fresh start. For a while, it worked. I was busy, distracted, and surrounded by people who had no idea about my strange experience. The ticking was faint, barely noticeable, and I convinced myself it was just a memory, a phantom of my anxiety, nothing more. Until last week, I was working late, alone in the office, when I heard it again, clearer this time, and closer. The rhythmic, mechanical tick-tick-tick that had haunted me during those nights on campus. My stomach dropped as I froze in place, listening. The office was silent except for the ticking, which seemed to come from everywhere. No clock in the room, no visible source, just the sound, constant and unrelenting. I stood and scanned the room, my heart racing. The open plan layout offered nowhere to hide, but the shadows seemed darker than usual, stretching unnaturally long across the polished floors. The ticking grew louder, almost unbearable, and then, just like before, it stopped. And I wasn't alone. At the far end of the office, near the frosted glass doors to the conference room, I saw it, the figure, the same faceless, shifting form I had seen behind the clock face. It didn't move toward me this time. It just stood there, its smoky edges blurring and reforming as though it struggled to stay in one shape. I backed away slowly, fumbling for my phone, my eyes locked on the figure. My fingers were shaking so badly that I dropped it, the screen shattering as it hit the tile floor. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. The figure twitched at the noise, its head, or what I thought was its head, tilting unnaturally, and then it moved, not like a person. It didn't walk or step. It glided, or maybe flickered, closing the distance between us in an instant. I turned and ran, bolting for the emergency stairwell. The sound of ticking exploded around me, deafening, as though the walls themselves were vibrating with it. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air on the empty street. The city was eerily quiet, the hum of late-night traffic absent. Even the streetlights seemed dimmer, their orange glow barely cutting through the darkness. The ticking was gone, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I didn't go back to the office. I called in sick the next day and spent the weekend trying to convince myself it was stress, a hallucination brought on by overwork and exhaustion. But I knew better. 2 nights ago, I woke up at 3:07 a.m. to the sound of my bedside clock ticking. It's a digital clock. It doesn't tick. I stared at it, frozen, as the numbers on the display began to flicker. 3:07, 3:06, 3:05. The time was moving backward. The seconds were winding faster and faster until the screen went blank. And then I felt it, the shift in the air, the pressure, heavy and suffocating, filling the room. I didn't have to look to know it was there, standing in the corner, watching. I could feel it, the way you feel a storm rolling in, the way you just know when something isn't right. I haven't slept since. I don't know what it wants, or why it's following me, but I can't escape it. Not by moving, not by running, not by hiding. Time doesn't belong to me, it said. It was late October, and I was returning from a business trip in the Pacific Northwest. My flight had been canceled due to weather, so I had to take a ferry to cross the strait and get to my destination. It wasn't my first choice. I hated water travel, but I figured it was better than spending another night in a hotel. The terminal was eerily quiet. Most people had already caught the earlier ferries, and the weather was growing worse by the minute. The air smelled like rain and salt, and the wind whipped through the open spaces, biting into my skin. I boarded the ferry alongside a few others, a young couple with a sleeping baby, an older man in a heavy coat, and a handful of others who looked as weary as I felt. The ferry's interior was dimly lit, and most of the passengers headed straight to the indoor seating area. I opted to stay outside on the deck. The cold was preferable to the stale air inside. I leaned against the railing, watching the dark water churn below. That's when I noticed her, a woman, standing at the far end of the deck, her back to me. She was wearing a long, dark coat that swayed in the wind. Her hair was unkempt, and something about her posture struck me as off. She wasn't looking at the water or the shoreline. She was just standing there, staring into the darkness. I shook it off. People are weird, I told myself. Maybe she just wanted to be alone, like I did. Still, something about her presence made me uneasy. The ferry began to move, and the hum of the engines filled the air. I tried to focus on the horizon, but my gaze kept drifting back to the woman. She hadn't moved. Her head was tilted slightly, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. Then she turned. Her face was pale, almost gray in the faint light, and her eyes were wrong. They were wide, unblinking, and seemed to reflect the dim light like an animal's. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. She was looking directly at me. I don't know how long we stood like that, staring at each other. It could have been seconds. It felt like hours. Finally, she took a step toward me. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette with tangled strings. I backed away, gripping the railing. I glanced toward the door to the indoor seating area, debating whether to run for it. When I looked back, she was gone. I scanned the deck, my heart pounding. There was nowhere for her to go. The ferry was still moving, the water stretching out endlessly around us. I took a cautious step forward, peering into the shadows. "Looking for me," a voice whispered. I spun around. She was standing inches from me, her face too close to mine. Her breath smelled like damp earth, and her eyes. They were human, and they were black, endless voids that seemed to pull at my very soul. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet. When I looked up, she was gone again. I don't remember much after that. One of the crew members found me sitting on the deck, shivering and pale. He helped me inside, where the other passengers were huddled together, oblivious to what had happened. I didn't see the woman again for the rest of the trip. When the ferry docked, I practically ran off, desperate to get away from the water. As I walked toward the terminal, I glanced back one last time. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face. Those eyes, like twin voids, boring into me. I kept telling myself it wasn't real. Maybe I was overtired from the trip. Maybe the rough weather was playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew. The next morning, I convinced myself it was over. I was far from the ferry now, in a bright, bustling city. I went about my meetings, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was subtle at first, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the kind that makes you glance over your shoulder for no reason. I chalked it up to nerves until I saw her again. It was in the reflection of a window. I was sitting in a cafe, trying to focus on my laptop, when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The window across from me showed the busy street outside. People passed by in hurried blurs, but then there she was, standing perfectly still in the middle of the crowd, facing me. Her dark coat swayed slightly, even though there was no wind. I turned around sharply, my heart hammering in my chest. The spot where she'd stood was empty. The crowd bustled on, oblivious. That was was when I realized she wasn't just watching me, she was following me. For the next few days, she appeared everywhere, always at a distance, always just out of reach, in the lobby of my hotel, standing in the rain outside, in the reflection of a store window, unmoving while everyone else rushed by. Once, I thought I heard her whisper my name, but when I turned, no one was there. By the time my trip ended, I was desperate to leave the city. I changed my flight to an earlier one, skipping the ferry entirely. As the plane ascended, I finally allowed myself to relax. Whatever was happening, whatever she was, I was leaving it behind. Or so I thought. Back home, things were normal for a while. I started to convince myself it was just a weird hallucination brought on by stress and exhaustion. Weeks passed, and life went on. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of knocking. It was slow, deliberate, coming from my front door. I checked my phone. 3:14 a.m. my stomach churned. I live alone, in a quiet neighborhood. No one should have been knocking at that hour. I got up, heart pounding, and crept to the door. Through the peephole, I saw nothing but the empty porch. I stood there for a moment, debating whether to open it. The knocking stopped. Relieved, I turned to go back to bed. That's when I heard it again, this time from the window in my living room. I froze. The blinds were closed, but the knocking was unmistakable. Slowly, I approached the window, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run. I lifted the edge of the blind and peeked out. She was standing there. Her face was inches from the glass, her black eyes locking onto mine. A wide, unnatural smile stretched across her face, her teeth gray and uneven. Her head tilted slightly, as if studying me. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over the coffee table. The knocking grew louder, more frantic. Then it stopped. Silence filled the room, heavy and oppressive. I waited, barely daring to breathe. When I finally worked up the courage to check the window again, she was gone. That was 2 nights ago. I haven't seen her since, but I know she's still out there, watching, waiting. I don't know what she wants, or why she chose me. All I know is that no matter where I go, she'll find me. I've tried to tell myself she's gone, that it's over, but I know better. Every time I think I'm safe, there's a sign, a shadow in the corner of my eye, a faint knock I can't explain, the feeling of being watched that sends shivers down my spine. She's not gone. She's never gone. Last night, I decided to do something I've never done before. I stayed up all night. No sleep, no distractions. Just me, sitting in the middle of my brightly lit living room, clutching a heavy flashlight like a weapon. If she came back, I'd see her. I'd be ready. At first, the night was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you question every little creak and groan of the house. Around 2 a.m., the power flickered just once, for a second. Then it came back on. I told myself it was nothing. The wind outside was howling. It must have been the weather. But then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. It was faint, almost like rain, but too deliberate. It came from the back door this time. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and forced myself to stand. My legs felt like lead as I crept toward the sound. The tapping continued, steady and slow. When I reached the back door, I hesitated. Through the frosted glass window in the door, I could make out a shadow. Someone or something was standing there. Go away, I shouted, my voice trembling. The tapping stopped. Silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I froze, panic washing over me in waves. The door was locked, but the knob twisted and rattled as if someone was testing it. I backed away, my heart racing, and grabbed my phone. I didn't know who to call. The police. What could I tell them? That I was being haunted by a woman from a ferry. The rattling stopped, and I let out a shaky breath. But then I heard it again, the knocking. Not at the back door this time. It was coming from the window behind me. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. She was there, her face pressed against the glass, that same twisted smile stretching across her face. Her breath fogged up the window as she whispered something I couldn't hear. Her eyes, those endless, black voids, stared into mine, and for a moment, I couldn't move. Then she started pounding on the glass, harder and harder. The sound echoed through the house, each impact making the window shudder. I snapped out of my trance and bolted upstairs, locking myself in the bedroom. I sat on the floor, flashlight clutched in my hands, staring at the door. The pounding continued downstairs, growing louder and more frantic. I don't know how long it went on, minutes, hours. Time blurred into nothingness. Eventually, the sound stopped. When the sun rose, I finally worked up the courage to go back downstairs. The house was empty, but the signs of her visit were everywhere. The back door was covered in smudged fingerprints, and the window she'd been pounding on had faint cracks spiderwebbing across the glass. I don't know what she wants or why she's tormenting me. I've thought about leaving, moving to another city, another country, anywhere, but I know it won't matter. She'll find me. She always finds me. I've started keeping a journal, writing down every detail I can remember about her. Maybe it'll help me understand what she is, or why this is happening. Or maybe I'm just trying to hold on to my sanity. To anyone reading this, please take my advice. If you ever see a woman in a dark coat standing alone, staring into the distance, don't approach her. Don't look at her. Turn around, leave, and don't look back. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I had just started my shift at the university's art gallery. It wasn't a particularly busy gallery, just a small annex tucked away on campus, mostly used by students and the occasional curious professor. My job was simple: make sure no one touched the art and lock up at closing time. That day, the main exhibition was a collection of abstract sculptures by a local artist. Some pieces were colorful and playful, while others were darker, almost menacing. One in particular always gave me the creeps: a tall, jagged piece made of blackened metal that looked like it had been struck by lightning. It was positioned near the far corner of the gallery, partially hidden by a divider wall. The shift started like any other. A few students wandered in, some sketching the pieces, others barely glancing at them before moving on. By 5 p.m., the gallery was empty, as it often was in the late afternoons. I did my usual rounds, checking that everything was in order. When I passed the dark sculpture, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It wasn't just the way it looked, it was the feeling I always got near it, like the air was heavier, thicker. I shook it off and returned to the front desk to count down the register. The building was silent, save for the faint hum of the air conditioning. As I was finishing up, I thought I heard something, a faint metallic scraping sound. I froze, my pen hovering over the ledger. Probably just the AC, I muttered to myself. But the sound came again, louder this time. It wasn't the hum of machinery. It was sharper, like metal dragging across concrete. My heart pounded as I stood up and looked around. The gallery was small enough that I could see most of it from the front desk, but the far corner where that sculpture was situated was hidden. Against my better judgment, I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and walked toward the sound. As I rounded the divider, I stopped in my tracks. The sculpture wasn't where it had been. It had moved. Not far, maybe a foot or two, but enough that its position was unmistakably different. I stared at it, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe someone bumped into it earlier, but no, it was far too heavy for that. The scraping noise came again, and this time, I realized it was coming from the floor beneath the sculpture. I shone my flashlight down and saw faint scratch marks on the concrete, as though the sculpture had been dragged. The air felt colder now, and my breathing became shallow. I wanted to leave, but I also didn't want to turn my back on it. Then, as I stood there, paralyzed, I saw it. The sculpture moved. It wasn't much, just a slight tilt, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The jagged edges seemed to bristle, and I swear I heard a low, grinding sound, like a groan. I backed away slowly, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I reached the front desk, the lights in the gallery flickered, then went out completely. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it with shaking hands. The next day, I called in sick and emailed my resignation. I didn't explain why I couldn't. The gallery director never mentioned anything unusual when I went to pick up my final paycheck, and I didn't ask. I don't know what I saw that day, and I don't want to know. All I know is that something in that gallery wasn't just art. A few weeks after I quit, I started to convince myself that maybe I had imagined it all. Stress, exhaustion, or just a trick of the light, anything to explain away what had happened. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that what I saw was real. Then, one night, I got a message from an old coworker, Liz. We'd worked a few shifts together, though we were never particularly close. Her text was short and casual. Hey, weird question. Did you ever notice anything strange with that black sculpture at the gallery? I stared at the message, my heart racing. I debated whether to respond. Eventually, I typed back. Why, her reply came almost instantly. I swear it moved. Like, I walked past it earlier and it was in one spot, but when I came back, it was closer to the middle of the room. Thought I was losing my mind. I hesitated, then decided to come clean. You're not imagining it. That thing does move. I quit because of it. The typey bubbles appeared, then stopped, then started again. Finally, she replied, oh my god, I was hoping you'd tell me it was nothing. I told her boss, and she just laughed it off. But honestly, it creeps me out. I felt a sick sort of validation. It wasn't just me. I told her to be careful and to quit if she could. She didn't reply after that, and I figured she'd just let it go. A few days later, I saw a news article shared on social media: local university art gallery closed for renovations after incident. My stomach dropped as I clicked the link. The article was vague, but it mentioned that a student had been injured while visiting the gallery. No names, no details about the injury, just that the student was found unconscious near a sculpture and had been taken to the hospital. The black sculpture wasn't mentioned specifically, but I knew. I texted Liz again, but I never got a response. I even tried calling her a few times, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I checked her social media, nothing. It was like she disappeared. I wanted to believe she just blocked me, but something about it felt wrong. Weeks turned into months, and I tried to move on with my life. But every so often, I'd have dreams about that sculpture. In my dreams, it wasn't just sitting there. It was chasing me, its jagged edges scraping against the floor as it moved faster and faster, the grinding sound echoing in my ears. I started avoiding art galleries altogether. Even walking past sculptures in public spaces made me uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that it, or something like it, was watching me waiting for me to come too close. To this day, I don't know what that thing was or why it was in the gallery. I don't know what happened to Liz, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that there are things in this world that shouldn't be touched, shouldn't be seen. And if you ever come across a sculpture that feels wrong, like it's watching you, like it's alive, turn around and walk away. Years passed, but the memory of that sculpture never really left me. I'd done my best to move on, moved to a different city, started a new job, and tried to forget about everything that happened at the gallery. But some nights, I still woke up in a cold sweat, haunted by the sound of metal scraping across concrete. Then, one rainy evening, I received a package. There was no return address, just my name and current address scrawled in a shaky hand. My stomach turned as I stared at it. I hadn't given my address to many people since moving. With trembling hands, I opened it. Inside was a single photograph, printed on glossy paper. It was a picture of the black sculpture, but not how I remembered it. The edges looked sharper, the jagged metal more twisted, like it had somehow grown or morphed since the last time I saw it. But the most unsettling part was the background. It wasn't the gallery anymore. It was a dark, unfamiliar room with bare concrete walls and a single, flickery fluorescent light. Underneath the photograph was a handwritten note. "It's found you." I dropped the photo, my heart racing. My first thought was that this had to be a prank. Someone from the university, maybe even Liz, trying to mess with me. But the dread settling in my gut told me otherwise. I hadn't spoken to anyone from that time in years. How would they even know where I lived? I spent the next few days jumping at every sound, every shadow that moved in the corner of my eye. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I started leaving lights on at night, locking every door and window, even though I knew deep down that wouldn't help. Then, a week after the package arrived, the nightmares started again. This time, they were worse. In the dreams, I wasn't just being chased by the sculpture, I was trapped in that dark room from the photograph. The walls seemed to close in, the flickering light casting warped shadows that seemed to move on their own. And always, the grinding sound grew louder, closer, until I woke up gasping for air. One night, I woke to a sound that wasn't from a dream, a faint scraping noise coming from the hallway outside my apartment. My blood ran cold. It was the same sound I'd heard in the gallery years ago. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the door, my heart pounding in my ears. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate, like something was dragging itself across the floor. I peered through the peephole but saw nothing, just the empty hallway, dimly lit by the overhead light. I wanted to convince myself it was my imagination, but then I saw it. A shadow moved at the edge of the hallway, just out of sight. It was tall and angular, with jagged edges that seemed to bristle like the teeth of a saw. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. The scraping grew louder, closer. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my keys and ran out the back door of my apartment, not stopping until I was several blocks away. I didn't care that I was barefoot or that it was pouring rain. I just needed to get away. That night, I checked into a motel on the edge of town. The next day, I packed up what little I could carry and left. I didn't even give my landlord notice. I just abandoned the apartment and drove as far as I could. Now, I keep moving, never staying in one place too long. I've changed my name, my job, everything about my life. But no matter where I go, I can't escape the feeling that it's still out there, looking for me. And sometimes, late at night, I hear it, the faint, unmistakable sound of metal scraping across the floor. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.